Hello everyone and welcome back to the Unexplained Diaries. Here on this channel I share real-life encounters with beings from beyond the skies to help you unwind and drift off to sleep. Before we dive in, I would love to hear from you. Leave a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. Now, find a comfortable spot, relax, and let's begin. I found the circle just after sunrise on a Tuesday in early September. I worked as a groundskeeper for a public park outside Duluth, Minnesota. The park wasn't huge, but it covered enough land to keep a maintenance crew busy year-round. Ball fields, walking trails, picnic shelters, playgrounds, and a large open meadow near the western edge of the property. Most mornings started the same way. Unlock gates, check trash bins, look for storm damage, make sure nobody had vandalized anything overnight. That morning was cool and damp. The kind of morning where fog sat low over the grass and everything felt quiet. I was driving a utility cart toward the meadow when I noticed something unusual. At first I thought it was a patch of dead grass. Then I got closer. The circle was almost perfectly round, maybe 30 feet across. Every blade of grass inside it had been flattened. Not torn up, not burned, just pressed down, like something enormous had rested there overnight. I parked the cart and walked around it. The shape was precise, too precise. The edge formed a near-perfect boundary between flattened grass and normal grass. No tire tracks, no footprints, no signs of people. The center looked exactly like the outer edge, everything pressed in the same direction. I crouched down and touched it. The grass felt normal, slightly damp, nothing unusual. I remember standing there for several minutes trying to figure it out. Maybe kids, maybe some weird weather event, maybe somebody had used equipment after hours. None of those explanations really fit. I took a few photos with my phone and continued my morning. By lunch, the entire maintenance crew had heard about it. Everyone had an opinion. Wind, pranksters, a temporary structure removed overnight. One guy insisted it was caused by a small tornado. Another blamed campers. Nobody knew. The circle remained there all week. People started noticing it. Families walking through the park stopped to take pictures. Teenagers stood in the middle of it and filmed videos. Children treated it like a giant target painted on the ground. That part becomes important later. At the time, it seemed harmless. Wednesday evening, I was locking up one of the restroom buildings when I noticed a strange light over the trees. Nothing dramatic, just a single white light. Stationary. Low on the horizon. I assumed it was an aircraft, but when I glanced back a few minutes later, it was gone. The sight lasted maybe 20 seconds. I forgot about it almost immediately. Thursday morning, I found something else. Several dead birds. 3 of them, all within a few yards of the circle. That wasn't impossible. Birds die. Animals die. Parks have wildlife. Still, it caught my attention because the birds looked untouched. No injuries, no signs of predators. Just lying there. I disposed of them and moved on. The next few days stayed normal, or mostly normal. The circle slowly became flatter. Kids kept playing there, people kept taking pictures, life went on. Then the men showed up. It was Friday afternoon, hot, sunny, the kind of late summer day where the air felt heavy. I was repairing a broken sprinkler head near the baseball fields when a coworker named Tyler drove over. "Some guys are looking for you." I wiped dirt off my hands. "What guys?" He shrugged. "Suits." That immediately sounded odd. Nobody wore suits to a public park. I followed him toward the maintenance building. The 2 men stood beside the entrance. Dark suits, dark ties, polished shoes. One tall and thin, one shorter and broader. Both looked completely out of place. The shorter man smiled when he saw me. "Mr. Cole Hensley?" "Yeah, we'd like a moment of your time." Neither introduced themselves, neither offered identification. The taller man carried a notebook. The shorter man carried nothing at all. I asked what this was about. The taller man answered, "Ground disturbance." Not an explanation, just 2 words. I frowned. "The circle?" Both men nodded. The shorter one asked, "Was any material collected?" I stared at him. "What?" "Samples." The word sounded rehearsed, like he'd practiced it. "No." The taller man wrote something down. The shorter man continued, "No soil samples?" "No." "No vegetation samples?" "No." The men exchanged a glance. Relief. Actual relief. The kind people show when they hear good news. That caught my attention immediately. I asked who they worked for. The shorter man smiled. "Environmental review." Again, not really an answer. The taller man asked another question. Has anyone else collected material from the site? Not that I know of. More writing, then silence. The shorter man looked toward the meadow. May we see it? I drove them over in the utility cart. Neither spoke much during the ride. The tall one occasionally looked at the sky. The shorter one watched the trees. Not casually, carefully, like he expected to see something. When we reached the circle, both men got out immediately. They walked around the perimeter, slowly, studying it. The taller man never stepped inside, not once. The shorter man eventually did, only briefly, just enough to examine the center. Then he stepped back out, neither touched anything. Neither took photographs, neither used measuring equipment. The whole inspection felt strangely incomplete. After several minutes, the shorter man turned toward me. How many people entered this area? I laughed. Hundreds. That answer seemed to surprise him. How many? It's a public park. The taller man stopped writing. The shorter man's smile faded slightly. Hundreds? Probably. A long silence followed. Then came the question. Were children among them? I nodded. The reaction was immediate. The taller man looked up from the notebook. The shorter man went completely still. For the first time since arriving, he looked genuinely uncomfortable. Not scared. Uneasy. Like he'd heard something he didn't want to hear. Children played here, he asked. Yeah. His eyes drifted toward the circle, then toward the playground in the distance. The taller man said quietly, when? All week. The two men exchanged a look. Not confusion, not surprise. Concern. Real concern. The shorter man rubbed the back of his neck, a completely human gesture. The first normal thing I'd seen him do. Then he asked, any illnesses? What? Among the children. No. He seemed relieved. Again, that same relief I'd seen earlier. I finally lost patience. What exactly are you worried about? Neither answered. The taller man closed the notebook. The shorter man changed the subject immediately. Has the shape altered since discovery? I stared at him. The question felt deliberate, like he wanted to move on. I answered anyway. A little? How? Flattered. The taller man nodded, almost as if he expected that. The shorter man walked around the edge one final time, then stopped suddenly. His attention focused on something near the center. I looked too. Nothing. Just grass. Yet he stared for several seconds, then looked away. Whatever had caught his attention apparently wasn't there anymore. The interview continued another 10 minutes. Most questions made little sense. Had animals avoided the area? Not really. Had anyone reported unusual dreams? No. Had park visitors mentioned humming sounds? No. Had lights been observed nearby? I remembered the white light over the trees. When I mentioned it, both men became interested immediately. Not excited. Focused. The taller man asked exactly where I'd seen it. The shorter man asked how long it remained visible. When I finished describing it, neither commented. The notebook came out again. More writing. Eventually, the men thanked me for my time. That should have been the end. But before leaving, the shorter man asked one final question. A strange one. Did the circle appear complete when you found it? I frowned. What do you mean? Was any portion missing? No. He nodded slowly. The answer seemed important. Then both men headed toward the parking lot. I followed at a distance, mostly because I wanted to see what kind of vehicle they drove. A black sedan waited near the entrance. No visible license plate, no dealership badge, no manufacturer logo, nothing. Just smooth black paint. The men got inside. The sedan drove away. I stood there watching until it disappeared. Then I returned to work. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the conversation, especially the part about the children. Why would that bother them? The circle wasn't dangerous, at least not as far as I knew. Saturday morning, I arrived early. The meadow looked normal from a distance. Then I noticed the circle had changed. Not dramatically, just enough to bother me. The grass inside had begun standing back up, except for one section. A narrow strip running through the center remained completely flattened, almost like a path. I hadn't noticed it before. I walked across the circle. The strip led toward a small cluster of trees at the edge of the meadow. Nothing unusual waited there, just trees. Yet something about the alignment felt deliberate. I followed it anyway. About 50 yards into the trees, I found a shallow depression in the soil. Not a hole, just an indentation, roughly circular, maybe 3 feet wide. The dirt inside looked darker than the surrounding ground. I stared at it for a while, then left. I didn't tell anyone. Something about it felt ridiculous. By Monday, the circle had nearly vanished. Grass continued rising. The shape became harder to see. Within another week, it was mostly gone. Just a faint discoloration remained. Life returned to normal. Then, nearly a month later, I received a call from Tyler. "Remember those suit guys? Yeah, you should come look at something." I met him after work. He drove me to the maintenance shed. Without speaking, he handed me a photograph. Security camera image. Nighttime. The meadow. The circle was still visible in the picture because the footage had been recorded before it disappeared. Two men stood inside it. The same two. The timestamp showed 3:12 a.m., several days after they'd visited. Both stood perfectly still near the center, looking down, not at the grass, at something between them. Something the camera couldn't quite resolve. A blurry shape, dark, low to the ground. The next frame showed the men alone. The shape was gone. The frame after that showed the circle empty. No men, no shape, nothing. Tyler asked if I knew where they'd gone. I told him no. Then I noticed something else. The timestamp. 3 minutes had passed between the second frame and the third. Not one frame. 3 full minutes. Yet the footage contained no images from that period, just a gap, as if the camera had simply stopped recording. The next morning, I walked out to the meadow before sunrise. The circle had long since vanished. Only normal grass remained. Children played soccer there later that afternoon. Families spread picnic blankets nearby. Nobody noticed anything unusual. But standing in the exact center, I could still make out a faint ring in the grass if the light hit it just right. And every once in a while, usually near sunset, I would catch people stopping as they crossed that spot. Not for long. Just a second, looking down, like they'd noticed something, then continuing on without saying a word. I saw the lights at 4:18 in the morning while fishing alone on Lake Kiowee in South Carolina. I remember the exact time because I checked my watch right before it happened. The weather had been strange all night. Not stormy, just heavy. Low clouds sat over the lake, and there was enough mist on the water to blur the shoreline. The moon was hidden most of the time. Everything looked gray. I liked getting out before sunrise because the lake was quiet then. No jet skis, no pleasure boats, just fishermen and the occasional bird hunter. I launched my aluminum boat from a small public ramp around 3:30 a.m. and headed toward a cove I'd fished dozens of times. Nothing unusual happened for the first 40 minutes. I caught one small bass, lost another, drank bad coffee from a thermos, normal morning. Then I noticed the fish finder acting oddly. The depth reading flickered, not dramatically, just enough to catch my attention. 27 feet, 29, 26, back to 28. The water there should have been steady. I tapped the screen, the reading stabilized. A minute later it started again. Then the display flashed completely blank, not off. Blank, just for a second. When it came back, I assumed the unit was dying. It wasn't new. I made a mental note to check the wiring later. A few minutes after that, I heard something splash. Not near my boat, farther out, maybe 100 yards. I looked up expecting to see a fish breaking the surface. Instead, I saw a light, under the water. At first, I thought it was another boat, but it wasn't. The light sat beneath the surface. Not deep, maybe 10 feet down. Bright white, moving slowly. I stood up immediately. The light traveled across the cove in a smooth arc, then another appeared, then a third. 3 lights moving underwater. I remember saying, "What the hell?" out loud. There was nobody around to hear it. The lights weren't huge. Each one looked about the size of a basketball from where I sat. Maybe larger, hard to judge through water. They moved independently. One drifted toward the center of the cove. The others split apart. The strange part wasn't their brightness. It was the way they moved. Fish don't move like that. Boats definitely don't. The lights would stop completely, then change direction without turning. Just instant movement. Smooth, controlled, silent. I watched for nearly 10 minutes. The fish finder had completely stopped working by then. The screen showed nothing but random flickering lines. At one point, all 3 lights gathered close together. They remained motionless for several seconds, then spread apart again. The movement reminded me of people searching a room. Not random wandering. Systematic. Back and forth. Covering ground. The thought made me uncomfortable. I don't know why. Then one light headed directly toward my boat. I felt my stomach tighten. The light stopped maybe 30 feet away, below the surface. Stationary. Watching. At least that's how it felt. The lake remained completely quiet, no engine noise, no birds, nothing. Just me and that light under the water. Then all three lights dimmed simultaneously, not switched off, dimmed. The glow faded gradually until the water became dark again. A few seconds later, they were gone. The fish finder immediately returned to normal. Depth reading, temperature, everything. I sat there for a long time staring into the black water. The sun eventually came up. I went home. For the next few days, I mostly kept the story to myself. I mentioned it to my brother. He blamed underwater drones. I mentioned it to a friend. He thought I'd seen reflections. Neither explanation fit, but I didn't argue. Life went on. Then things started feeling strange. 3 nights after the sighting, I woke around 2 a.m. because my dog was growling. His name was Murphy, golden retriever. Friendly to everyone, he almost never growled. Yet there he was standing beside the living room window with his fur raised. Looking outside, I checked the yard. Nothing. No people, no animals, no vehicles. Murphy kept staring into the darkness long after I stopped seeing anything. The next morning, I found muddy footprints near the side fence. Not unusual. People occasionally cut across the property. Still, something bothered me. The prints ended halfway across the yard. They didn't continue toward the road, didn't continue toward the woods, just stopped, as though whoever made them vanished. I convinced myself rain had washed part of the trail away. It was the sensible explanation. Then came the knock at the door. 4 days after the sighting, around 6 in the evening. The sky was overcast. Cold rain tapped against the windows. Murphy started growling again before the knock came. Not barking, growling, low and steady. I looked through the peephole. 2 men stood on the porch. Dark coats, dark trousers, one tall and thin, one shorter and broader. Neither held umbrellas despite the rain. Neither looked wet. I opened the door halfway. "Can I help you?" The shorter man smiled politely. "We'd like to discuss an observation." The wording immediately felt odd. What observation? The lake. That got my attention. The tall man removed a small notebook from his coat. No badge, no identification, nothing. I asked who they were. The shorter man answered, "Field Review." Not an agency, not an organization. Just 2 words. I almost laughed. Instead, I asked what they wanted. The tall man flipped open the notebook. "You observed lights beneath the water." Again, not a question. My stomach tightened. I hadn't reported anything, hadn't posted online, hadn't spoken to anyone besides family and one friend. "Who told you that?" The shorter man ignored the question. "Were the lights searching?" The question caught me off guard. "Searching?" "Yes. Yes." I stared at him. "Searching for what?" He smiled slightly. "We're asking you." The rain continued hitting the roof. Murphy stood behind me staring at the men. Neither acknowledged him. The tall man asked again, "Did they appear to be searching?" I thought about the way the lights moved, the patterns, the stops, the changes in direction, the way they spread apart and regrouped. I shrugged. "I don't know." The shorter man waited. I found myself answering honestly. They seemed lost. The reaction was immediate. Both men exchanged a look. Not surprise, not confusion, something else. The shorter man's smile disappeared. The tall man closed the notebook. Without another question, without another word. Just closed it. The shorter man nodded once. "Thank you." Then they turned toward the porch steps. I blinked. "That's it?" Neither answered. The shorter man paused only long enough to say, "That is useful." Then they walked away. I followed them onto the porch. Rain soaked my shirt almost immediately. The men crossed the yard. A black sedan sat at the curb, no visible license plate, no manufacturer logo, nothing identifying it. The taller man got into the passenger seat. The shorter man paused beside the driver's door. He looked back at me. For a second, I thought he might explain something. Instead, he asked one final question. "Did any of the lights stop beneath your boat?" I hesitated. The answer was yes, one had. The shorter man watched my face, then nodded before I spoke, like he'd gotten the answer anyway. He climbed into the car. The sedan pulled away. I stood there watching until it disappeared around the bend. Murphy remained beside me, still growling. The next morning, I drove back to the lake. I don't know why. Curiosity, maybe. The weather had cleared. Blue sky, the calm water, normal conditions. I launched the boat and headed toward the same cove. Everything looked ordinary. The fish finder worked perfectly. No lights, no strange movement, nothing. I almost convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing. Then I noticed something floating near the shoreline, a white object. I moved closer. It turned out to be a buoy. not unusual by itself, except I knew there hadn't been a buoy there before. This section of the lake didn't use them. I pulled alongside. The buoy looked old, weathered, covered in algae. A metal tag hung from one side. I leaned over and read it. The tag contained only numbers, coordinates, latitude and longitude, nothing else. No agency name, no identification number, just coordinates. I entered them into my phone. The location appeared on the map immediately. Not on land, not somewhere else on the lake, directly beneath where I'd seen the lights. I sat staring at the screen for a long time. Eventually, I cut the buoy loose and let it drift away. Something about it felt wrong. A week later, I returned to the cove again. The buoy was back. Same spot, same coordinates, as if it had never moved. I left it alone. Months passed. No more lights, no more visitors, no more footprints. Life returned to normal. Then one morning near the end of summer, I saw a newspaper article about a small search operation on the lake. Nothing dramatic, just a brief mention buried near the back pages. A state survey team had spent 2 days examining an area near the center of the reservoir. No explanation given. No results reported. The accompanying photo showed several boats working the water. In the background sat a black sedan parked near the boat ramp. 2 men stood beside it, one tall, one shorter, watching the lake, not the survey boats, not the workers, the lake itself, like they were waiting for something to come back. I uploaded the video at 11:17 p.m. on a Thursday and forgot about it by the next afternoon. That was the strange part. It wasn't some viral clip. It didn't blow up. It didn't even get many views. At the time I was 17 and obsessed with astrophotography. I lived with my mom outside Flagstaff, Arizona, in a neighborhood where the houses sat far enough apart that you could still see the stars clearly at night. Most evenings I dragged my telescope into the backyard and recorded whatever I could. Planets, meteor showers, the moon, sometimes satellites. Nothing unusual. The video happened completely by accident. It was late October, cold enough that I wore a hoodie outside. The sky was clear and the moon was bright enough to cast shadows across the yard. I had a DSLR camera mounted to my telescope. Nothing expensive, just equipment I'd spent years saving for. I was filming the moon because I wanted to practice stacking footage for better detail. I recorded about 20 minutes of video before packing everything away. Later that night, while reviewing the footage in my room, I noticed something cross the moon. At first, I assumed it was a bird. Then I slowed the footage down. The object moved too fast, not impossible fast, just strange. It appeared as a dark shape crossing the moon's surface from one side to the other. No lights, no details, just a silhouette. What caught my attention was the shape. It looked roughly triangular, not perfectly, more like a wedge. I watched the clip maybe 20 times, still couldn't identify it. Eventually, I uploaded it. Not because I thought it was a UFO, I genuinely wanted opinions. The video got maybe 40 views overnight. A couple comments. One person suggested a bird, another said satellite. Someone else claimed it was an insect close to the lens. That seemed likely enough. By lunchtime the next day, I'd already stopped thinking about it. Then I noticed the car. Black sedan. Parked across from our house. The vehicle sat on the opposite side of the street beneath a cottonwood tree. Engine off, nobody visible inside. At first I assumed it belonged to a neighbor, but when I got home from school around 3:30, it was still there. Same spot, same position. The sedan remained there through dinner. Around sunset I checked again, still there. Mom noticed it too. Maybe somebody's visiting, that seemed reasonable. Around 8 p.m. I looked again, gone. I shrugged it off. Then the doorbell rang the following afternoon, Friday. Cloudy skies, light wind. Mom was at work. I was home alone. When I opened the door, 2 men stood on the porch. Dark suits, dark ties, polished black shoes, one tall, one shorter. Neither looked threatening, just out of place. The taller man smiled politely. "Are you Ethan Mercer?" I nodded. He immediately asked, "Are your parents available?" I told him my mom was at work. The 2 men exchanged a brief look. Not disappointment, more like adjustment. The shorter man spoke next. "We'd like to ask a few questions regarding imaging equipment." That wasn't what I expected. I thought maybe they were salesmen or survey people. What kind of equipment? The camera used during lunar observation. I felt my stomach tighten. The moon video? That had to be what they meant. I asked who they were. The taller man answered, "Documentation review." Not a company, not an agency, just 2 words. The answer made no sense. I considered closing the door. Instead, curiosity kept me standing there. The shorter man smiled. We only need a few minutes. Against my better judgment, I let them into the living room. The entire time, they seemed less interested in the house than in looking around it. Not snooping, observing, like they were trying to understand how things fit together. The shorter man paused beside our thermostat, studied it, then moved on. The taller man noticed family photos on a shelf. He examined them for a second longer than normal people would. Neither commented. Eventually we sat down. The questions began, not about the video, about the camera, the exact model, the lens, the telescope mount, the storage card, the battery. Every question focused on the equipment itself, not the object I'd recorded. That struck me as odd immediately. Finally I asked, "Don't you want to see the video?" The taller man smiled. "We've already reviewed it." That answer made me uneasy. The video barely had any views. How had they found it so quickly? The shorter man continued. "What firmware version was installed?" I blinked. "I don't know." He nodded, not frustrated, just writing notes. Then came another question. "Has the camera ever captured unexplained images before?" "No." "Distorted images?" "No." "Images containing individuals not present during photography?" I stared at him. "What?" The taller man immediately changed subjects. What type of memory card was used? The transition felt abrupt, like the shorter man had asked the wrong question. The interview continued. Camera, lens, settings, exposure, storage, never the object, not once. After nearly 20 minutes, I finally opened the video myself. I pulled it up on my laptop. Look, the dark object crossed the moon exactly as before. The men watched silently. Neither seemed interested, neither leaned forward, neither asked questions. The clip ended. The shorter man pointed instead toward the metadata panel. "What time was this recorded?" I checked, told him. He wrote it down. The taller man asked, "Has the camera remained in your possession continuously since then?" "Yeah." The 2 men exchanged another look. A strange one, like relief. That happened several times during the conversation. Questions, answers, relief, as though they worried about something specific. Eventually, the taller man asked to see the camera itself. I retrieved it from my room. The moment I handed it over, both men became more attentive than they'd been the entire visit. The shorter man held it carefully, examined every side, every button, every compartment. At one point, he removed the battery and stared at it, not reading the label, just looking at it like he'd never handled one before. That sounds ridiculous, I know, but that's exactly how it felt. He turned it over several times. How frequently does this require replacement? The battery? Yes, I explained, charging. He nodded, still studying it. The taller man became fascinated by the memory card slot. I showed him how it worked. He watched closely, too closely, like he was memorizing a process. The entire thing felt backward. Most people would care about the video. These men cared about the camera. Eventually, they stood to leave. The shorter man thanked me. The taller man handed back the camera, then paused. His eyes remained on it for another second. Has it become warm recently? The question caught me off guard. Warm? Unusually? No. The men looked at each other. Again, that same silent communication. Then they headed toward the door. I followed. As they stepped onto the porch, the shorter man asked one final question. Did the object appear before or after the recording anomaly? I frowned. What anomaly? His expression changed instantly. Not fear, not panic, recognition, like he'd made a mistake. The taller man immediately interrupted. "Thank you for your time." The conversation ended right there. The 2 men walked toward the street. A black sedan waited nearby. No visible license plate, no badges, no logos, nothing. They drove away. I stood there for a long time afterward. The phrase stuck with me, recording anomaly. That night, I rewatched every second of footage, frame by frame, nothing unusual. Then I noticed something, near the beginning of the video. A section I'd skipped dozens of times. The footage froze briefly, only for 3 frames. Less than a second. Easy to miss. I zoomed in, the moon remained visible, the stars remained visible. But during those frozen frames, something else appeared, a dark vertical shape at the edge of the image. Not crossing the moon, standing beside it, impossible perspective, impossible scale. The shape vanished immediately when the footage resumed. I assumed it was corruption, a digital artifact, except the object crossing the moon happened several minutes later. The anomaly occurred first, exactly like the man had implied. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I checked the original file. The frozen frames were gone, completely. No corruption, no shape, nothing. I thought I'd made a mistake. Then I checked the backup copy. Gone there too. Every version matched perfectly. The anomaly had vanished. A week later, I stopped by a local astronomy club meeting. Mostly older hobbyists, retirees, enthusiasts. I mentioned the video. One man asked to see it. I pulled it up on my phone. The object still crossed the moon, exactly as before. As the group watched, an older member named Carl frowned. "That's strange." "What?" He pointed toward the screen. "Your timestamp." The recording date displayed normally. The time did not. Instead of 9:42 p.m., the metadata briefly showed something else, a completely different value. Not numbers, letters, just for a split second. Then it returned to normal. Nobody else seemed to notice. Carl certainly did. His face changed immediately. He stopped talking. A few minutes later, he packed up and left. I never saw him at another meeting. About 3 months afterward, I found the camera sitting on my desk one evening, exactly where I'd left it. The battery had been removed. The memory card sat beside it. I lived alone with my mom. She never touched my equipment. Neither item showed signs of damage. Nothing appeared missing. The strange part was the battery door. Someone had opened and closed it so many times that the latch had become loose, as if it had been repeatedly inspected. I checked the footage on the memory card. Everything remained intact. Moon videos, planet videos, meteor footage, normal files. Then I found one image I didn't recognize, just a single photograph, no timestamp, no metadata, no file creation date. The picture showed my telescope in the backyard, taken from behind, at night. The camera angle sat several feet away from where I normally stood. I had no memory of taking it. In the photograph, I was visible beside the telescope. Looking up at the sky, and standing several feet behind me were two blurry figures in dark suits, watching the camera instead. The voice first came through on a rainy Tuesday night in March while I was sitting in my radio room behind the garage. I lived alone outside Sandpoint, Idaho, on a wooded property about 15 minutes from town. The house sat at the end of a gravel road with no close neighbors. At night, especially in bad weather, it felt a lot farther from civilization than it really was. Ham radio had been my hobby for almost 20 years. Nothing unusual about that. I liked listening more than talking. Weather nets, long-distance contacts, emergency traffic, random conversations drifting across frequencies late at night. Most radio operators eventually hear strange things. Interference, broken transmissions, numbers stations if you're lucky. So when I heard the voice, I didn't think much of it at first. The rain was hitting the roof hard enough that I could hear it over the equipment. I was scanning around 11:40 p.m. when a weak signal broke through the static. A man's voice, very faint, repeating something. I adjusted the volume. The voice repeated the same sequence again. Numbers, coordinates. At least that's what they sounded like. Latitude and longitude. The transmission was weak enough that I missed parts of it. The voice would read the coordinates, pause, then repeat them. Same calm tone every time. No emotion, no introduction, no call sign, nothing, just coordinates. Over and over. I listened for maybe 15 minutes before the signal faded away. By midnight, it was gone. I wrote down what I could understand and forgot about it. The next night, it happened again. Same frequency, same voice, same coordinates. The weather was different. No rain, clear sky. The transmission appeared at almost exactly the same time, 11:43 p.m. This time, I managed to record part of it. I also copied the coordinates more accurately. The next day, I entered them into a map. The location landed deep inside National Forest, nearly 80 miles away. No roads nearby, no campgrounds, nothing obvious. I assumed it was some kind of beacon or transmission test. Maybe someone messing around, maybe not. The third night, things got stranger. The coordinates changed. Not completely, just slightly. A few seconds difference. Enough to move the location several hundred yards. The voice itself stayed identical, same tone, same pacing, same pauses. That bothered me. Human voices vary naturally. This one didn't. I listened till nearly 1 in the morning, then it stopped. For the next week, the transmissions continued. Every night. Always late, always repeating coordinates, always moving slightly, like whatever location it referenced was drifting through the woods. I became obsessed with it, not because I thought it was paranormal, because it made no sense. Eventually, I brought it up during a monthly radio club meeting. There were about 15 of us gathered in the back room of a VFW hall, mostly retirees, a couple truck drivers, one former engineer, the usual crowd. I played part of the recording. People offered theories, military testing, signal reflection, some kind of automated station. Nobody had a real answer. The meeting ended around 9. I drove home through light fog. Nothing felt unusual, at least not yet. I noticed the first strange thing when I pulled into my driveway. There was another vehicle parked near my mailbox, a black sedan. Engine off, lights off. The car wasn't there when I left. I stopped at the end of the drive. For a second, I considered backing out and leaving. Instead, I pulled forward. As my headlights swept across the sedan, I saw two men standing beside it. Not sitting inside, standing, waiting. Both wore dark coats, dark slacks. Neither reacted to the headlights. I parked near the garage and stepped out. The taller man approached first. "Mr. Randall Pierce?" I nodded. "Can I help you?" The shorter man smiled politely. "We were hoping you could help us." Neither introduced themselves. Neither offered identification. The tall one looked toward the house, then back at me. "You recently discussed unusual radio traffic." It wasn't a question. I immediately thought of someone from the club. Maybe one of the members mentioned it. Still felt strange. "Who are you?" The shorter man answered, "Signal Documentation." I laughed. "That's not an organization." "No." The answer came immediately. No hesitation, no embarrassment, just no. That caught me off guard. The tall man continued. "The transmission, has the voice ever used your name?" I stared at him. Out of every possible question, that wasn't one I'd expected. "My name? Yes. No." The two men exchanged a look. Relief. Actual visible relief. The shorter man's shoulders loosened slightly. The taller man nodded. Neither tried to hide it. That bothered me more than the question itself. "What difference would that make?" I asked. Neither answered. Instead, the taller man opened a notebook. "Have you responded? To the transmission?" "Yes." "No." Another nod. More writing. The shorter man asked, "Have you visited the coordinates?" "No." Again, that same look between them. Relief. Like I kept passing some test without realizing it. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes. Every question felt wrong. Not because it was threatening, because it focused on details I hadn't considered important. Had the voice ever changed tone? No. Had it ever sounded closer than before? No. Had I heard it anywhere besides the radio? No. Had I dreamed about it? No. Each answer seemed to satisfy them. Finally, I asked the obvious question. "What's at the coordinates?" The taller man closed the notebook. "We don't know." That answer felt rehearsed. The shorter man added, "We only monitor transmissions." "Why?" Neither replied. Instead, the shorter man looked toward the tree line beyond my house. For several seconds, he just listened. Then he asked, "May we hear the recording?" I invited them inside. Looking back, that was probably stupid, but they weren't aggressive. If anything, they seemed nervous, especially after the question about my name. The three of us sat in the radio room. The recording played through external speakers. The voice repeated the coordinates. Calm, steady, unchanging. The men listened carefully. Neither took notes, neither interrupted. Then something happened. Near the end of the recording, static crackled briefly, just a second or two. I'd heard it a dozen times before. Never paid attention. The shorter man immediately stood up. "Stop." I paused the audio. The room went silent. The two men looked at each other. Not relieved this time. Concerned. The shorter man said, "Play that section again." I did. Static, coordinates, nothing else. The taller man leaned closer to the speaker. Again. I replayed it 3 times, 4, 5. Eventually I said, "What are you hearing?" Neither answered. The shorter man finally looked at me. "You don't hear it?" "Hear what?" Silence. Then, "Good." The way he said it made my skin crawl. Around midnight, they finally left. The black sedan rolled down the driveway without headlights. I watched until it disappeared behind the trees. That should have been the end. Instead, things became stranger. The next transmission arrived the following night. Same frequency, same voice. But something had changed. The coordinates stopped moving. For the first time, they repeated the exact same location over and over. No variation, no drift, just one point. Again and again. I listened for almost an hour. The signal remained stronger than usual, clearer, closer. At 12:08 a.m., the voice paused. That had never happened before. The silence lasted maybe 5 seconds. Then the voice spoke again. Not coordinates, a sentence. Only one. I couldn't understand most of it through the static, just fragments. Words lost beneath interference, but I clearly heard one phrase. Not yet. Then the coordinates resumed. I barely slept that night. The next morning, I checked the recording. The sentence was there, faint but unmistakable. That afternoon, I called several members of the radio club. None had heard anything unusual. That evening, I decided to drive toward the coordinates. Not all the way, just close enough to satisfy my curiosity. The location sat deep inside Forest Service land. There were logging roads nearby, nothing more. The drive took nearly 2 hours. The farther I went, the worse the weather became. Fog rolled through the trees, visibility dropped, the woods felt empty. No campers, no hunters, no traffic. Eventually, I reached the nearest accessible road and parked. The coordinates remained another mile or so beyond. Too far to walk comfortably in the dark. I sat there for a while staring into the trees. The forest looked completely normal. Then I noticed another vehicle, black sedan, parked farther down the road. No lights, no movement, just sitting there. My stomach dropped immediately. Same shape, same dark windows. I couldn't see if anyone occupied it. The fog made everything blurry. After maybe 30 seconds, headlights appeared behind me. Another vehicle approaching. I turned around. By the time I looked back, the black sedan was gone. Not driving away. Gone. The road stretched empty in both directions. No engine noise, no taillights, nothing. I went home. The next club meeting happened 2 weeks later. I asked around again. Nobody admitted speaking to the men. Nobody knew who they were. Most members laughed when I described them. One guy, an older operator named Bill Corcoran, didn't laugh. He became very quiet. After the meeting, he pulled me aside. "Did they ask about your name?" I stared at him. "How'd you know that?" Bill looked toward the parking lot. "They asked me something similar once." "When?" "Long time ago." "What happened?" He shook his head. Then he said something I still think about. "They only get worried when the signal learns somebody." Before I could ask what he meant, he left. The transmission stopped 3 nights later, completely. No coordinates, no voice, no static, nothing. The frequency went silent. I monitored it for months afterward, never heard another sound. Then, nearly a year later, I found something odd while organizing old recordings. The original files contained metadata timestamps. Most recordings matched exactly when I remembered making them, except one, the recording from the night the 2 men visited. According to the file timestamp, it had been created at 2:07 a.m., 3 hours after I'd gone to bed. I checked every backup, same timestamp, same file. The recording itself sounded normal. Coordinates, static, the voice. But near the end, buried beneath interference, there seemed to be another voice, extremely faint, extraneous, almost impossible to hear. I increased the volume, then increased it again. The second voice spoke only once, just 3 words, not coordinates, not numbers. A question, quiet enough that I wasn't completely sure I'd heard it correctly, but it sounded like, "Has he answered?" The response came immediately afterward, the same calm voice that had repeated coordinates for weeks. One word, clearer than anything else on the recording. "No." Then the transmission ended. I found the folder on a hot August afternoon while reorganizing a storage room beneath the museum. The museum sat in a small town along the Oregon coast. It wasn't large, mostly local history, logging exhibits, fishing artifacts, old photographs, and donated family collections. The sort of place where every room smelled faintly of paper, wood polish, and dust. I'd worked there for 6 years as the archivist. Most days were predictable. Catalog documents, digitized photographs, answer questions from researchers, nothing exciting. The storage room was in the basement behind a locked steel door. We kept uncatalogued donations there until they could be processed. That day, I was sorting through several boxes that had arrived years earlier from an estate donation. Old newspapers, property records, letters, the usual. Then I found a gray file folder tucked inside a cardboard records box. No catalog number, no accession sticker, nothing, just a typed label. Coastal Incident Reports, 1954 to 1958. That immediately caught my attention because I'd never seen it before. I sat down at a work table and opened it. Inside were roughly 30 reports, typed pages, handwritten witness statements, police notes, newspaper clippings. Most involved strange lights, objects over the ocean, reports from fishermen, Coast Guard sightings, pilots, lighthouse keepers. Some were easy to explain, others weren't. One report described a white light pacing a fishing vessel offshore for nearly 40 minutes. Another involved multiple witnesses watching something hover above a headland before shooting away. A sheriff's deputy had written 3 pages describing a silent object over Highway 101. What stood out wasn't the sightings themselves, it was how carefully everything had been collected. Every witness, every date, every location, cross-referenced and organized. Someone had spent years building the file, yet there was no indication who, no author, no department, no explanation for why it existed. I spent nearly 2 hours reading through it. By the time I left work, I was genuinely interested, not convinced of anything, just curious. That evening, I took notes home. The next morning, I returned to the museum early. The weather had changed overnight. Heavy fog rolled in from the ocean and wrapped around the town. The harbor disappeared completely. Even the buildings across the street looked blurred and distant. Around noon, I was still reviewing the documents when Sandra, our receptionist, called down from the front desk. Leah? Yeah? There are 2 men asking for archives. I figured researchers had arrived. That happened occasionally. Send them back. A minute later, the 2 men entered the archive room. The moment I saw them, something felt off. Not threatening, just wrong. Both wore dark suits despite the summer weather. One was tall and thin with pale skin and neatly combed black hair. The other was shorter, broader, with a polite smile that never seemed to change. Neither carried a briefcase. Neither introduced themselves. The taller man spoke first. We'd like to review a collection recently located in storage. I stared at him. What collection? Coastal Incident Reports. The exact title. My stomach tightened slightly. The folder hadn't been cataloged. Nobody should have known I'd found it. I asked who they were. The shorter man smiled. Records review. From where? A pause. Then regional. Not a real answer. I considered refusing. Instead, curiosity got the better of me. I retrieved the folder. The taller man immediately opened it. Both began reading. What struck me was how familiar they seemed with the contents. Not because they quoted anything from his mouth, because they flipped directly to specific pages. One witness statement, then another, then a newspaper clipping. Almost like they already knew where everything was. The shorter man stopped on a report dated 1956. A fishing captain had described 3 lights moving over the water during a storm and read it carefully. Then asked, "Have any additional versions of this report been located?" "Not that I'm aware of," he nodded. The taller man turned another page. A pilot sighting from 1957. He read it, then looked disappointed, not confused, disappointed, as though something was missing. After about 20 minutes, the shorter man pointed toward the photocopier across the room. "We'll require copies." "No problem." I stood and walked over. The machine was a large office copier we'd had for years. Simple enough. Open lid. Place document. Press button. The shorter man followed. Then something strange happened. He stared at the copier, not casually. Studied it, like he'd never seen one before. I assumed he was joking. "Need help?" I asked. His smile remained unchanged. "Yes." The answer surprised me. I showed him where the originals went. He watched carefully. Too carefully. Like he was memorizing each step. When I finished, he looked at the control panel. "Which command initiates duplication?" The wording sounded odd. I pointed to the copy button. He pressed the wrong one immediately. The machine started scanning to email. He stepped backward, actually startled. The taller man approached. "What did it do?" "It's scanning." Neither moved. The copier beeped. The shorter man looked at me. "Why?" I laughed because I genuinely thought they were messing with me. Neither laughed back. I canceled the job and showed them again. The taller man tried next. Same thing. He pressed 3 unrelated buttons before finding the correct one. I remember thinking it felt like watching someone use a copier after being told about one but never actually seeing it. The whole thing should have been funny. Instead, it felt unsettling. Neither man seemed embarrassed, just confused. Eventually, we got the copies made. The shorter man gathered them into a neat stack, then asked another strange question. "How long has this machine been here?" I shrugged. "Maybe 10 years. He looked at the copier, then at the taller man. Something passed between them. A look, not surprise, calculation. The taller man changed subjects immediately. "Who located the folder?" "I did." "When?" "Yesterday." "Did you review it?" Of course. Both men became very still. The shorter man asked, "How much did you read?" "Most of it." Another look. Then silence. The taller man flipped through his notebook. "Did any report seem familiar?" The question caught me off guard. Familiar how? No particular reason. I thought about it. One report actually had felt familiar. The 1957 pilot sighting. Not because I'd seen it before, because the location mentioned happened to be near a headland I'd visited often growing up. I told him that. The answer seemed to relax both men. The shorter one nodded. Geographic familiarity. The way he said it sounded like a diagnosis. Then came another question. Did any report seem personally familiar? I frowned. No. Again, visible relief. That was the second time I'd seen them react emotionally. Both times it involved what I had or hadn't recognized. The conversation continued another 15 minutes. Most questions focused on the reports themselves, not the sightings, not the witnesses. The reports, who wrote them, how they arrived at the museum, whether any pages appeared missing, whether duplicates existed, whether I'd found related materials. I had no answers. Eventually, they packed up their copies. The shorter man thanked me. The taller man closed the folder. Then he paused. "May we review one final item?" "What?" He turned to the last page in the collection. I hadn't paid much attention to it before. A simple typed sheet. No witness statement, no report, just a list of names, 23 of them. No explanation. The taller man studied it for nearly a minute, then closed the folder. "Thank you." I expected them to leave. Instead, the shorter man looked toward the archive shelves. "How often are records relocated?" "What do you mean?" "Moved." I shrugged. "Whenever necessary." He nodded slowly, then asked, "And afterward, do they generally remain where placed?" The question felt bizarre. "Usually." He seemed satisfied. The two men finally left, or so I thought. About 10 minutes later, I walked through the lobby and found them standing beside the museum's self-service touchscreen kiosk, just staring at it. The screen displayed local exhibit information. Nothing complicated. The shorter man tapped it. A menu appeared. He immediately withdrew his hand. The taller man leaned closer. Neither seemed to understand what they were looking at. Sandra later described them as acting like tourists from another country. That wasn't quite right. It felt more like they were encountering everyday objects slightly out of sequence, as if they'd learned what things were called before learning how they worked. Eventually they left. I watched through the front windows. A black sedan sat at the curb, no visible license plate, no manufacturer logo, just black paint and dark glass. They drove away. I assumed that would be the end. It wasn't. The next morning I returned to the archive room. The folder was gone. Not missing exactly. Gone. Its catalog entry didn't exist. The storage box where I'd found it was empty. Even the notes I'd taken had vanished from my desk drawer. I spent most of the day searching. Nothing. Sandra noticed my frustration. When I explained what happened, she looked confused. "What folder?" "The coastal reports." She frowned. "What coastal reports?" I thought she was joking. She wasn't. The visitor log showed no record of the two men, no names, no sign-in sheet, nothing. The security cameras should have settled the matter. Instead, they made it worse. I reviewed footage from the previous afternoon. The men appeared entering the building, appeared reading documents, appeared using the photocopier, everything normal. Until I reached the section where they copied the reports. The footage showed them standing beside the machine, looking at it, waiting, watching. For almost 6 minutes, the copier never moved, never operated, no papers entered, no papers emerged. Yet I clearly remembered helping them use it, remembered holding the documents, remembered hearing the machine run. The video showed none of that. I watched it 3 times, same result. The men stood motionless beside an inactive copier, then walked away. That evening, after everyone else left, I returned to the archive room one last time. I wasn't even sure what I was looking for. The room felt unusually quiet. The fog outside had returned. The windows looked gray and opaque. I sat at the work table where I'd first opened the folder. Something caught my eye underneath the table. A single sheet of paper, folded in half. I picked it up. The page was yellowed with age, old typewriter text, no heading, no date, just a short paragraph. It read, "Follow-up review completed. Materials removed for reclassification. Copies not authorized. Return expected within approximately 70 years. At the bottom sat 2 signatures, one tall and narrow, one shorter, both written in black ink. The paper crumbled slightly at the edges when I touched it, like it had been sitting there for decades. I looked closer. Beneath the signature, someone had written a note in pencil, very faint, almost erased. I could barely read it. It said, "They still don't understand the machines." I noticed the car on a Monday night while delivering groceries out near Red Creek, West Virginia. It was late, around 9:30. The weather had been miserable all day. Cold rain, low clouds, and that kind of fog that settled in the hollows and stayed there. Most people were already home for the night, which was normal for that area. Once you got a few miles outside town, the roads felt empty after dark. I drove deliveries for a regional grocery service. Not exactly exciting work, but it paid the bills. Most of my route covered rural roads, farms, and scattered houses tucked into the hills. The crossroads sat about 12 miles outside town. Nothing special about it, just a four-way intersection where two county roads met. No gas station, no businesses, no streetlights, just woods, fields, and a few mailboxes. That first night, I noticed a black car parked on the shoulder near the intersection. Engine off, lights off. I assumed someone was lost. By the time I came back through an hour later, it was gone. I didn't think about it again. Then I saw it Tuesday. Same place. Wednesday too. By Thursday, I started paying attention. It was always there when I passed. Always at night. Always parked in exactly the same spot. The car never had its lights on, never moved, never seemed occupied. It was difficult to identify because the crossroads stayed dark. My headlights only caught it for a few seconds each time. Black sedan, dark windows, nothing unusual beyond that. Friday night, I slowed down, not enough to be obvious, just enough to get a better look. The car looked clean, very clean. That stood out because every vehicle in that area collected mud and road grime during the winter. This one looked freshly washed, no visible license plate either, at least none that I could see. When my headlights swept across the windshield, I thought I saw someone sitting inside. Then the angle changed and the reflection disappeared. I kept driving. The next few days, I found myself looking for it every night. Always there. Same location, same darkness, same silence. Around that time, I also started noticing something else. People standing outside at odd hours. Not many, just enough to seem strange. A man beside a fence staring upward. A woman standing in a field behind her house. An older guy leaning against a truck, looking at the sky instead of the road. Maybe it meant nothing. People look at the sky all the time. Still, after a while, I started noticing it more. Then came the customer. His name was Russell Boone. At least that's what the delivery order said. The address sat way out past the crossroads, nearly at the end of my route. I delivered there on a Wednesday afternoon. Cold day, cloudy, wind rattling the trees. The house sat alone on a ridge overlooking several miles of forest. When I arrived, Russell was already standing in the driveway waiting. That wasn't unusual. Lots of customers tracked deliveries. What stood out was what he was doing. He was looking through binoculars, not at me, at the sky. When he noticed my truck, he lowered them immediately. He looked embarrassed, like I'd caught him doing something private. I unloaded the groceries. He signed for them. The whole interaction lasted maybe 2 minutes, but I remember him clearly. Late 60s, gray beard, blue flannel jacket, old baseball cap, deep lines around his eyes. Friendly enough. Just distracted. When I drove away, I looked in the mirror. He had already gone back to scanning the sky with the binoculars. That same night, I passed the crossroads again. The black sedan was there. For some reason, I checked the clock. 9:42 p.m. The car sat exactly where it always did. I continued another mile, then saw headlights behind me. Fast. Much faster than most people drove those roads. The vehicle closed the distance quickly. I figured someone wanted to pass. Instead, it stayed behind me. A little too close. Not aggressive, just close. I kept driving. The vehicle followed for nearly 3 miles. Then the headlights disappeared. Not turned around. Disappeared. 1 second they were there. The next they weren't. I slowed. Checked mirrors. Nothing. No side roads nearby. No driveways. No explanation. The rest of the route felt off after that. And by the time I headed back toward town, the roads were empty again. The sedan remained at the crossroads. Still parked. Still dark. Then Thursday happened. The weather turned colder. Heavy fog rolled through the hills after sunset. Visibility dropped so low I had to cut my speed in half. I finished my last delivery around 9:15 and started heading back. The crossroads appeared through the fog. The black sedan was there. Except this time, two men stood beside it, waiting. My stomach tightened immediately. Both wore dark coats, dark trousers, one tall and thin, one shorter and broader. Neither moved as my truck approached. I considered driving straight through. Instead, I slowed. The taller man stepped toward the road and raised a hand. Not enough to block me, just enough to signal. I pulled onto the shoulder. The engine kept running. The shorter man approached my window. He smiled politely. "Good evening." I nodded. "Evening." The smile stayed exactly the same. "You're the delivery driver." Not a question. "Yeah." The taller man stood a few feet back, watching. The shorter one asked, "Have you seen anyone watching the sky in this area?" I actually laughed. The question felt so random. "What?" "Watching the sky." I looked between them. "What do you mean?" The shorter man thought about it, then said, "Standing outdoors for extended periods, looking upward." The wording sounded strange, not how normal people talked. I shrugged. "A few people, I guess." The taller man immediately asked, "Recently?" "Sure." "How many?" I frowned. "I don't know." The shorter man nodded as if that answer made sense. Then came another question. "Did any of them appear to be expecting something?" I stared at him. "What exactly is this about?" No answer. Instead, "Did any appear to be expecting something?" The fog drifted through my headlights. Everything felt oddly quiet. "No," the shorter man smiled again. "Good." That word bothered me. "Good," like there was a preferred answer. The taller man finally spoke. His voice was calm. "Have you delivered to a man named Russell Boone?" Every hair on my arm stood up. I hadn't mentioned Russell, hadn't mentioned deliveries, hadn't mentioned anything. "Yeah." The shorter man and taller man exchanged a quick glance. Not surprise, recognition. The taller one asked, "When?" "This afternoon." "What was he doing when you arrived?" I said nothing. The shorter man waited. Then, "Binoculars." I felt my stomach drop. Neither man looked away, neither smiled, neither seemed proud of the guess, just interested. I slowly nodded. The shorter man looked toward the fog-covered hills. The taller one wrote something in a notebook. I finally asked, "Who are you?" The shorter man answered, "Field assessment." "Assessment for who?" No answer. The taller man continued writing. I looked toward their car. No plate, at least none visible. The body looked oddly plain. No badges, no logos, nothing identifying the manufacturer, just black paint. The shorter man asked another question. "Did Mr. Boone mention lights?" No. "Sounds?" No. "Coordinates?" I blinked. "What?" He immediately moved on, like he hadn't meant to ask. The taller man closed the notebook. "Thank you." That seemed to be the end of it. The shorter man stepped back, then paused. "One more thing." I waited. He tilted his head slightly. "When you pass this intersection..." His eyes drifted toward the sky above the trees. "Have you ever noticed anything stopping?" I frowned. "Stopping what?" He smiled again. "The sky." Then he walked away. Neither explained, neither elaborated. They got into the sedan. The engine never started. At least not that I heard. One moment they were entering the car. The next moment the headlights came on. Low beams only. No sound, no rumble, nothing. The sedan rolled away into the fog. I sat there for almost a minute before leaving. The conversation replayed in my head the entire drive home, especially the part about Russell. How did they know? The next day I delivered to his address again. Different order, different items, same customer. When he came outside, I asked a casual question. "Been doing much stargazing?" He froze, just for a second, then laughed. "Not lately." The answer felt rehearsed. I noticed the binoculars sitting on the porch behind him. That evening I drove the route again. No sedan. The crossroads sat empty. For the first time all week, I actually felt relieved. Then I noticed something else. Fresh tire tracks. They ended near the spot where the sedan usually parked. Only ended. No tracks leading away. I got out with a flashlight. The mud clearly showed where a vehicle had sat. The tracks came in from the road, then stopped. No departure tracks, no turnaround marks, nothing. Just impressions ending at the shoulder. I stood there staring at them until headlights approached from behind. A pickup truck. Local guy. Probably wondered what I was doing. I got back in my vehicle and left. A few days later, Russell Boone's address vanished from the delivery system. Not unusual by itself. Customers moved, accounts closed, people switched services. Still, I asked dispatch about it. The woman checked, then frowned. "No customer by that name." "Sure there is," was. I nodded. Right. She shook her head. No, there's no record. I laughed because I assumed she was looking at the wrong screen. She turned the monitor toward me. Nothing. No address, no orders, no account history, no Russell Boone, as if he'd never existed. I drove out there on my day off. The house remained, the driveway remained, the mailbox remained, but the place looked empty. No vehicles, no footprints, no sign anyone lived there. A realtor sign stood near the road. For sale. The number on the sign connected me to a local agency. I called. The woman said the property had been vacant for nearly a year. I sat in my truck staring at the house while she talked. Then I hung up. As I pulled away, something caught my eye. Movement near the tree line behind the house. Two figures, standing side by side, watching, too far away to identify. Dark coats, motionless. I looked away for 1 second while turning the truck around. When I looked back, they were gone. That night, I drove through the crossroads one last time. The black sedan had returned, parked exactly where it used to be. The fog was thick enough that I almost missed it. As I passed, my headlights illuminated the windshield. For a brief moment, I could see inside. Two men sat in the front seats, looking upward. Not at me, not at the road, at the sky. And for the first time all week, they didn't seem to be waiting for something. They seemed to be watching it leave. I found the object around 4 in the afternoon on a damp October day while mapping a timber parcel in the Allegheny National Forest. The rain had stopped an hour earlier, but everything was still wet. Water dripped from the pines, fallen leaves stuck to my boots. The sky was that flat gray color that made it hard to tell whether evening was coming or not. I worked as a surveyor for a small company out of Warren, Pennsylvania. Most of my job involved property boundaries, timber assessments, easement work, and the occasional dispute between neighbors who suddenly cared very deeply about where a fence sat. That week I was mapping a remote section of woodland owned by a logging company. No trails, no campsites, no roads, except an old access route that hadn't been maintained in years. I was alone. That part wasn't unusual. The object caught my eye because it reflected light through the leaves. At first, I thought it was an old oil drum, or maybe a piece of machinery left behind decades ago. There was a shallow depression beneath a cluster of hemlocks about 50 yards off the line I was surveying. Something metallic protruded from the soil at an angle. Only a small section was visible, maybe 18 inches. It looked smooth, not rusty, not painted, just dull gray metal. I walked over to it. The ground around it felt strange under my boots, firmer than it should have, almost compacted. The object itself didn't resemble anything I recognized. It wasn't cylindrical, wasn't square. The exposed section curved gently inward like part of a much larger shape buried beneath the earth. I knelt beside it. No seams, no bolts, no markings. I brushed away wet leaves and dirt with my glove. The metal felt cold, but not as cold as it should have been. I remember that specifically because the air temperature couldn't have been more than 45 degrees. The surface felt almost room temperature. I tapped it with my knuckle. The sound surprised me. Not because it was loud, because it wasn't. I expected a metallic ring. Instead, it made a dull thump like knocking on thick wood. I sat there staring at it for a while. The forest was quiet. Too quiet, maybe. No birds, no squirrels. Nothing except water dripping from branches. Then I noticed something else. The soil around the object contained almost no roots. That made no sense. In those woods, roots were everywhere. You couldn't push a shovel 6 inches without hitting them. Yet the dirt immediately surrounding the metal looked smooth and loose, as if something had displaced everything around it. I took a few photos with my phone. Then I marked the location on my GPS unit. I considered reporting it immediately, but curiosity got the better of me. I cleared away a little more dirt, not much, just enough to expose another foot or so. The shape continued downward, still no edges, still no seams. I remember reaching out and placing my bare hand against it, only for a second. The surface felt oddly smooth, not polished, just featureless. The moment I touched it, I heard a sound, a click, very faint. I jerked my hand away and looked around. Nothing, no movement, no animals, just trees. I stood there listening. The click didn't repeat. After another minute, I laughed at myself. Probably a branch settling somewhere. I finished marking the point, packed up, and headed back toward my truck. The walk out took almost 40 minutes. Halfway there, I realized I couldn't stop thinking about the object. Not because it frightened me, because it felt wrong. Like finding a piece of an airplane buried in Roman ruins. Everything about it seemed out of place. That night, I stayed at a small motel outside Tidiat. The logging company covered rooms whenever a site was far enough from town. I grabbed dinner at a diner, watched half a football game, and went to bed around 10. At 6:17 the next morning, someone knocked on my motel room door. 3 knocks. Pause. 2 knocks. I checked the clock because the pattern stuck out. Who knocks like that? I pulled on jeans and looked through the peephole. 2 men stood outside, dark coats, dark slacks, one tall and thin, the other shorter and broader. Neither looked like loggers. Neither looked like anyone who belonged at a roadside motel before sunrise. I opened the door halfway. "Can I help you?" The taller man smiled politely. "Mr. Nolan Mercer?" I immediately wondered how they knew my room number. "Who's asking?" "We'd like to discuss your survey activities yesterday." That woke me up faster than coffee. "What about them?" The shorter man spoke. His voice sounded rehearsed somehow. Not robotic, just overly precise. "Did you encounter any unauthorized debris?" I stared at him. "Unauthorized what?" "Debris." "What kind of debris?" The 2 men exchanged a glance. The tall one said, "Objects not associated with normal environmental conditions." I laughed. "I don't know what that means." "Metallic objects," the shorter one clarified. The laugh died. Neither man reacted. Neither seemed surprised. The tall one asked, "Did you discover such an object yesterday?" I should have lied. Instead, I said, "Maybe." The shorter man nodded. "Did you touch it?" "Not what it was. Not where it was. Not how large it was." "Did you touch it?" I felt my stomach tighten. "Why?" "Did you?" I thought about saying no. Something about the way he asked made me tell the truth. "Yeah." The shorter man looked disappointed. The taller man wrote something in a small notebook. "What exactly is this about?" I asked. Neither answered. The tall one continued writing. "How long was physical contact maintained?" I frowned. "What? How long did you touch the object?" "A second." "1 second? Maybe." The shorter man nodded. "Any symptoms? What kind of symptoms?" "Disorientation, auditory anomalies, time discrepancy." The words came out like a checklist. I shook my head. "No." The tall man looked up. "You heard no clicking sounds?" I froze. The notebook stopped moving. The shorter man's expression didn't change. Neither had mentioned clicking. I certainly hadn't. "How do you know about that?" I asked. The tall man ignored the question. "Was the clicking isolated or repetitive?" I stepped backward. "Who are you?" The shorter man smiled. "We're conducting environmental documentation." "No, you're not." His smile remained. "No." The admission came so casually that it caught me off guard. I glanced past them. The motel parking lot was empty except for my truck. No other vehicles, no sedan, no government SUV, nothing. I looked back. "How'd you get here?" The shorter man blinked. The question seemed to genuinely confuse him. "We arrived." The tall man closed his notebook. "Mr. Mercer, it would be helpful if you avoided returning to the object." "Why?" "Because it's being recovered." "By who?" "Interested parties." That answer irritated me enough that I almost laughed again. "What does that even mean?" The tall man looked at me for a few seconds. Then he said something strange. "Did the object appear buried before you arrived?" I frowned. "Yes." The shorter man quietly said, "Good." The tall one nodded. "Then leave it that way." Before I could ask anything else, they turned and walked away. I followed them into the parking lot. Cold morning air hit me. Mist hung low over the road. The men reached the edge of the lot, then continued walking. Not toward a vehicle, not toward the highway. Just down a narrow gravel service road leading into the trees. Within 30 seconds, the fog swallowed them. I stood there for another minute. No engine started, no doors slammed, nothing. I skipped breakfast and drove straight back to the site. Partly because I was stubborn, mostly because I wanted answers. The woods looked different in morning light. The fog lingered between the trees. Everything felt damp and muted. I followed my GPS coordinates directly to the location. The depression was still there. The hemlocks were still there. The object was gone. Not dug out, not extracted. Gone. The ground looked untouched. I don't mean neatly repaired. I mean untouched. No shovel marks, no tire tracks, no disturbed leaves, no pile of dirt. Nothing. Just forest floor. I checked my GPS 3 times. Same coordinates, same location. I walked in, widening circles around the site. No sign of excavation, no equipment tracks, no footprints. The object had occupied a space roughly the size of a refrigerator. Removing something like that should have left evidence. There wasn't any. Then I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The photos on my phone. I opened the gallery. The images were still there, same timestamp, same location, but something was wrong. The object wasn't visible. The pictures showed the depression, the leaves, the soil, the trees, no metal, no exposed surface, nothing. I zoomed in. The empty ground filled the frame. My memory insisted the object had been there. The photographs disagreed. I sat on a fallen log for nearly 10 minutes, trying to convince myself I'd somehow mistaken a root or rock for metal. Then I remembered touching it, remembered the smooth surface, remembered the click. As if responding to the thought, I heard the sound again. Click. Somewhere nearby. I stood immediately. The woods were still. Click. A little farther away this time. I turned toward it. Nothing. Then another. Click. Not mechanical, not loud, just enough to be heard. Moving through the trees, circling, I started walking back toward my truck. Not running, just moving steadily. The clicking followed, never close, never far, always somewhere I couldn't quite locate. After about 5 minutes, it stopped. The silence felt heavier afterward. When I reached my truck, something sat beneath the windshield wiper, a folded piece of paper, no envelope, no note. Just a single page torn from a notebook. In block handwriting were 6 words. Physical contact recorded. No further action. Nothing else. No signature. No explanation. I looked around the empty logging road. No people, no vehicles, only trees. I folded the paper and put it in the glove compartment. A month later, while organizing files from that survey project, I found the GPS coordinates again. Out of curiosity, I entered them into a mapping program. The location marker landed exactly where I remembered. Then I noticed something odd. An older satellite image existed from several years before. The image quality wasn't great, but there appeared to be a small circular clearing at that exact spot. Not a natural opening, too round, maybe 30 feet across. The newer image showed nothing except forest. The clearing was gone. Trees stood where it should have been, fully grown trees, not saplings, not recent growth. Trees that looked decades old. I checked 3 different map services, same result. The older image showed the clearing. The newer images showed uninterrupted woodland. A week after that, I received a package at my office. No return address. Inside was a printed copy of one of my photographs, the same photograph where the object no longer appeared. Someone had circled a section near the bottom corner. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. Then I zoomed in. My hand. The photo had captured my hand reaching toward empty ground, as if I were touching something invisible. Written beneath the circle in black ink were 4 words. Contact duration, 1.3 seconds. I never told anyone how long I touched it. Not exactly, not even myself. The paper disappeared from my desk 3 days later. No one admitted taking it. Sometimes, when I'm working alone in the woods, I hear faint clicking sounds somewhere beyond the trees. Never close enough to pinpoint. Never repeated long enough to record. Just a click, pause, another click, as if something is checking whether I'm still there. I took the photo on a Thursday evening in late November while walking along the north side of Blackwater Reservoir. The fog had rolled in early that day, not thick enough to shut down the roads, but enough to make everything feel smaller. The far shoreline disappeared completely. Trees became dark smudges. The water looked flat and colorless, blending into the sky until it was hard to tell where one ended and the other began. I liked walking there after work. I worked at a veterinary supply warehouse outside Asheville, North Carolina, and most evenings I needed an hour to clear my head before going home. The reservoir trail was usually empty once the weather got cold. That evening I only saw one other person, an older man fishing from a small gravel point near the dam. Other than that, I had the place to myself. The light appeared around 5:40. At first I thought it was a boat. Then I remembered boats weren't allowed on the reservoir after sunset. I stopped walking and looked out across the water. The light hovered above the fog. Not high. Maybe 20 or 30 feet above the surface. White, but not bright enough to hurt your eyes. It stayed perfectly still. I pulled out my phone. The camera struggled to focus through the fog, but I managed to take 3 pictures before the light moved. Not quickly. It drifted sideways, smoothly. No blinking, no beam, no sound that I could hear. Just a pale white light sliding through the mist. I remember lowering my phone and watching it for another minute. Then it dimmed. Not disappeared. Dimmed. Like someone turning down a lamp. A few seconds later, it was gone. I stood there waiting for it to reappear. It didn't. The reservoir became just water and fog again. The whole thing lasted maybe 3 minutes. I drove home afterward and texted the photos to my brother, Evan. His reply came back immediately. Drone? I sent back, too big. He replied, "You always say that." That was the end of it. At least I thought it was. The next day I showed the pictures to 2 coworkers during lunch. One thought it was a tower light, the other thought it was lens flare. Neither explanation really fit, but I wasn't trying to convince anyone. By Monday, I had mostly stopped thinking about it. Then the noises started. Not dramatic noises, nothing that made me jump. Just odd things. The first happened Sunday night. I was reading on the couch when I heard what sounded like someone tapping on a glass bottle. 3 taps. Pause. 2 taps. Very faint. I checked the kitchen. Nothing. The apartment was empty. I figured it came from another unit. The second time happened Monday morning while I was getting ready for work. Same pattern. 3 taps. Pause. 2 taps. This time it seemed to come from the bathroom wall. I stood there listening. It didn't repeat. Again, I assumed neighbors. Apartment buildings make weird sounds. Pipes knock. Walls settle. People drop things. I forgot about it until Wednesday. That was when the 2 men showed up. I was working inventory that morning. The warehouse wasn't glamorous, but I liked the routine. Shelves, forklifts, shipping labels, radios squawking every few minutes. Predictable. Around 10:30, my supervisor Dana walked over. "There are 2 guys here asking for you." I looked up from a clipboard. "Customers?" She shrugged. Didn't say. I followed her toward the front office. The moment I saw them through the glass, something tightened in my stomach. Dark coats, dark slacks, one tall and thin, one shorter and broader. Neither looked like customers. Neither looked like sales reps. The shorter man smiled when I entered. "Miss Natalie Mercer?" "Yeah." The taller man nodded politely. "We'd like a few minutes of your time." "About what?" The shorter man answered, "A witness statement." I frowned. "For what?" "The reservoir." That got my attention immediately. Dana looked between us. "Everything okay?" she asked. The taller man smiled. Routine follow-up. She didn't seem convinced, but eventually left us alone. The shorter man gestured toward an empty office. "Somewhere private?" I should have refused. Instead, I led them into a small conference room. The whole thing felt strange enough that I wanted answers. The door closed behind us. Neither man sat down. The taller one opened a notebook. The shorter one folded his hands in front of him. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then the taller man asked, "Before observing the light, did you hear any sounds?" I blinked. "What? Sounds? I saw a light. Before that," he said. I shrugged. "I don't think so." He wrote something down. The shorter man asked, "Any humming?" "No." The taller man wrote again. "Buzzing?" "No." "Clicking?" The word caught my attention. I don't know why. Maybe because of the noises in my apartment. Still, I answered honestly. "No." The shorter man looked at me carefully. "You're certain?" "Yeah." The taller man made another note. Then silence. I finally asked the obvious question. "Don't you want to see the photo?" Neither answered immediately. The shorter man smiled. "No." That genuinely surprised me. "You don't?" "We're not evaluating visual evidence." "Then why are you here?" The taller man looked up from his notebook. "We're evaluating associated observations." "What does that mean?" The shorter man replied. "Things that happened before, not after. Before." That struck me as oddly specific. I said, "I just saw a light. Did you?" The question came from the taller man, not confrontational, just curious. I stared at him. What else would I have seen? He looked at the notebook. The shorter man changed the subject immediately. "When you first noticed the light, what made you look toward the reservoir?" I opened my mouth, then stopped. Because I didn't know. I'd never thought about it. 1 second I had been walking. The next I had been looking toward the water. Why? I couldn't remember. The realization bothered me more than I expected. "I don't know," I admitted. The taller man wrote that down too. The shorter man nodded slowly, as expected. I sat back in my chair. "What exactly are you investigating?" Neither answered. The taller man flipped to another page. "Have you experienced unusual sounds since the sighting?" My stomach dropped. Just slightly. Enough to notice. I said nothing. The shorter man's smile faded. Miss Mercer. How do you know that? Know what? The sounds. The two men exchanged a glance, not a meaningful one, more like checking whether they should continue. The taller man closed the notebook. Can you describe them? I should have lied. Instead, I said, tapping. Both men became very still. The shorter man asked, patterned? I immediately regretted answering. What is this? He ignored the question. Patterned? I nodded. His eyes shifted briefly toward the ceiling. Listening. That was the impression I got. Listening to something I couldn't hear. Then he looked back at me. 3, pause. 2. It wasn't a question. I stared at him. Neither man looked surprised. The taller one opened the notebook again. Frequency increasing? No. Source location changing? I don't know. Have the sounds occurred outdoors? No. The shorter man looked relieved. Actually relieved. That was the first real emotion I'd seen from either of them. I said, who are you? The taller man answered this time, Witness Collection. That's not an agency. No. His honesty somehow made it worse. The shorter man asked, have you returned to the reservoir? No. Good. Why? No answer. The room felt smaller suddenly. Not physically. Just uncomfortable. Like the conversation had drifted somewhere I wasn't supposed to follow. I tried again. The photo. The shorter man smiled. What about it? You're not interested? No. Why not? Because surely that was the important part. The light, the pictures, the sighting. Instead, they'd spent 15 minutes asking about sounds. The taller man finally gave an answer. The light isn't the unusual part. Nobody spoke after that. I remember hearing forklifts outside, voices from the warehouse, normal sounds, the sort of things I suddenly wanted very badly. The shorter man checked his watch, then looked at me. One final question, I nodded. When the sounds occur, do they seem closer each time? I didn't answer, because they did. I just hadn't noticed until that moment. The first tapping had seemed distant. The second had come from the bathroom wall. The third had come from somewhere inside my bedroom. The shorter man saw the realization happen. His expression changed slightly, not fear, concern. The taller man stood up. We should leave. The shorter one nodded. Neither shook my hand, neither asked for my phone number, neither requested the photographs. The entire meeting had lasted maybe 20 minutes. At the door, I said, wait. They turned. If this is serious, tell me what's going on. The taller man looked genuinely thoughtful for a moment. Then he said, if the sounds continue, avoid responding. Responding how? The shorter man answered, anyway. Then they left. I watched through the front windows as they crossed the parking lot. No vehicle waited outside, no sedan, no government SUV, nothing. They walked around the corner of the building. I followed maybe 10 seconds later. The lot behind the warehouse was empty, no sign of them. That night I stayed awake longer than usual. I kept thinking about the questions, not the light. The sounds, why focus on that? Why care whether I heard anything before the sighting? Around midnight, I finally went to bed. At 1:13 a.m., the tapping started again. 3 taps, pause, 2 taps. This time it came from my bedroom door. Not the wall, not another apartment. The door. I sat upright. The room was dark. Streetlight filtered through the blinds. The tapping didn't repeat. I got out of bed, checked the apartment, nothing. No one. I returned to bed. 5 minutes later, I heard another sound. Not tapping. A voice. Very faint. So faint I couldn't make out words. Just the shape of a voice somewhere beyond the apartment. Maybe outside. Maybe in the hallway. Maybe not. I grabbed my phone and opened the photos from the reservoir. The light still appeared exactly as I remembered. White, round, hovering above the fog. Then I noticed something. Not in the light. Below it. A dark shape near the shoreline. I zoomed in. The image became grainy immediately. The shape looked human. 2 figures standing side by side at the edge of the water. Too far away to identify. Too small to be certain. I switched to the second photo. The figures were still there. Third photo. Still there. Standing in exactly the same position. Watching the reservoir. Or watching me. The next morning I drove back before work. The fog was gone. The shoreline looked normal. No footprints. No signs anyone had been there. Just water and rocks and dead grass. I stood at the exact spot where I had taken the photos, trying to remember what made me look toward the reservoir in the first place. After several minutes, I heard something. Very faint. Almost lost in the breeze. 3 taps. Pause. 2 taps. Coming from somewhere across the water. I left immediately. A few days later, I returned to the warehouse and asked Dana if she remembered the two men. She looked confused. What two men? The guys who came asking about the reservoir. She stared at me, then shook her head. No one came asking about a reservoir. I laughed because I thought she was joking. She wasn't. I checked the visitor log. There was no entry, no names, no record, nothing. The security cameras covering the front office showed customers, delivery drivers, employees. No two men, no conference room meeting, no trace they had ever been there. Except for one thing. On the conference room table sat a yellow legal pad. Most pages were blank. Near the center, one sheet had been torn out. The page underneath carried faint impressions from whatever had been written above it. I shaded it with a pencil. Slowly, words appeared. 3 lines. No visual anomaly confirmed. Auditory contact possible. Subject did not answer. The handwriting wasn't mine. Underneath those notes was a final line, smaller than the rest, almost pressed through the paper. Return if pattern advances to the window. The request came in on a rainy Wednesday morning just after the library opened. I worked as the local history librarian in a small coastal town in Oregon called Harbor Point. Most of my job involved helping people dig through old records, newspaper archives, property maps, and genealogy documents. The library itself sat on a hill overlooking the harbor. It was an older building with creaky floors, narrow aisles, and a basement archive room that smelled permanently of dust and cardboard. We got unusual requests all the time. People researching family histories, writers looking for obscure details, retired locals chasing old memories. Nothing about the email initially stood out. The subject line simply read, "Archive request." The message itself was short. Very short. The sender wanted a copy of the Harbor Point Gazette dated August 14th, 1968. That wasn't unusual either, until I checked the archive catalog. According to our records, that issue didn't exist, or more accurately, it wasn't supposed to exist. The catalog listed August 13th, then August 15th, nothing in between. At first, I assumed it was a clerical error. Old records were messy. I replied and asked for clarification. No response. A few hours later, curiosity got the better of me. I headed downstairs. The archive basement was quiet except for the hum of dehumidifiers. Most of the newspaper collection existed on microfilm reels stored inside metal cabinets. I checked the catalog again. No August 14th. Still, something bothered me. The date seemed too specific. So I started digging. About 20 minutes later, I found an old handwritten note attached to a filing drawer. The note looked decades old. Yellowed paper. Faded ink. 3 words. Destroyed. Flood. That made sense. The library had suffered basement flooding in the early 70s. Many records had been damaged. Problem solved, or so I thought. Then I found the reel. It wasn't where it should have been. It sat in a completely different cabinet behind unrelated materials. The label read, Gazette, Aug 1968. No indication anything was missing. I loaded the reel into a reader. The film started normally, August 1st, August 2, August 3. Everything appeared intact. Then I reached August 13. The next frame should have been August 15th. Instead, August 14th appeared. The supposedly destroyed issue. I remember staring at it for several seconds. The date was clearly visible. August 14th, 1968. The front page headline wasn't about politics or local news. It described unusual lights seen offshore, multiple witnesses, fishing crews, harbor workers, residents. The article wasn't sensational, just factual, yet something about it felt strange. The story occupied almost the entire front page. I kept reading. Several people reported bright lights hovering above the water during heavy fog. No explanation was offered. I copied a few notes for myself. Then the microfilm machine suddenly shut off. The screen went dark. The room became quiet. I assumed the bulb had failed. After a few seconds, the machine restarted on its own. When the image returned, the August 14 issue was gone. The reel now jumped directly from August 13th to August 15th. I rewound, checked again. No August 14th. I sat there confused. Maybe I'd loaded the reel incorrectly. Maybe I imagined it. That sounds ridiculous, but that was honestly my first thought. I spent another 30 minutes checking. Nothing. The issue had vanished. Eventually I went upstairs and forgot about it, at least for the rest of the day. The requester never replied. No follow-up email. No phone call. Nothing. Thursday morning brought heavy fog. The kind that rolled in from the ocean and swallowed half the town. Visibility dropped to maybe 100 feet. The library felt unusually quiet. Around noon, I noticed a black sedan parked across the street. Nothing particularly suspicious, just unusual. Most vehicles in town were pickups or SUVs. The sedan remained there all afternoon. Same position. Engine off, dark windows. I mentioned it to my coworker Sarah. She glanced outside. Maybe somebody's waiting for someone. Reasonable enough. Around 4 o'clock, the sedan disappeared. I didn't see it leave. It was simply gone. The next morning, the two men arrived. Dark suits, dark ties, polished shoes, one tall, one shorter, both looked completely out of place. The shorter man approached the information desk. His smile appeared friendly enough. "We're hoping you can assist us with archive inquiries." I assumed they were researchers, maybe historians, maybe journalists. "What are you looking for?" The shorter man exchanged a glance with the taller one. Then he asked, "Has anyone recently requested the August 14, 1968 edition of the Gazette?" The question hit me immediately. My stomach tightened. Why? The taller man opened a notebook. The shorter one smiled again. "Routine records verification." The answer sounded rehearsed. I hesitated, then told him the truth. "One person requested it by email." The taller man wrote something down. The shorter man nodded. "Did anyone else request the same issue?" No. The reaction was immediate. Both men visibly relaxed. Not dramatically, just enough to notice, like a weight had been lifted. The taller man stopped writing. The shorter one exhaled quietly. Relief. Genuine relief. That bothered me more than the question itself. I asked who they worked for. The shorter man answered, "Historical preservation." Another vague answer. Another title that sounded almost real without actually meaning anything. The conversation continued. Had the requester visited in person? No. Had anyone viewed related materials? No. Had copies been made? No. Each answer seemed to make them happier. The taller man eventually closed the notebook. Then came a question I wasn't expecting. "Did you locate the issue?" I stared at him. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then I nodded, briefly. The two men exchanged another look. Not relief this time. Concern. The shorter man leaned forward slightly. "You viewed it?" "Yes." "How much?" "Most of the front page." The taller man's pen stopped moving. The shorter man's smile faded. "Not completely. Just enough." "What did you observe?" "Observe." "Not read." "Observe." The wording felt strange. I described the article. Lights offshore, witness reports, fog, nothing remarkable. The two men listened carefully. When I finished, the shorter man asked, "Did you view any photographs?" I thought about it. "No." That answer relaxed them again. The taller man resumed writing. The shorter one nodded slowly. Then he asked something that made no sense. "Did the article appear complete?" "What?" "The text." "I think so." "You believe so?" "Yeah." He seemed satisfied. The conversation should have ended there. Instead, the taller man suddenly asked, "How old is the microfilm reader?" I blinked. "I don't know. Approximate age? Maybe 15 years?" He wrote that down too. Then they requested access to the archive room. Against my better judgment, I agreed. We headed downstairs. The entire walk felt uncomfortable. Neither man spoke, neither looked at books or displays. Their attention remained fixed on the archive room. Once inside, they moved directly toward the correct cabinet. No hesitation. No searching. Straight to it. That bothered me. The archive layout wasn't public. Visitors couldn't access the basement alone. Yet both men walked as though they'd been there before. The taller man opened the cabinet, pulled out the exact reel. First try, no checking labels, no scanning shelves, just reached for it. I watched him carefully. The shorter man noticed. "Something wrong?" I shrugged. "No." The lie sounded weak. The taller man loaded the reel into the reader. The machine powered on. The film rolled. August 13th, August 15th, no August 14th. Nothing unusual. The two men watched quietly. Then the shorter man smiled. "There appears to be no issue." The wording felt deliberate. No issue. Not no newspaper. No issue. The double meaning wasn't lost on me. The taller man removed the reel, returned it to the cabinet. Then both men stood silently for several seconds, almost as if waiting. For what, I couldn't tell. Finally, they thanked me for my assistance. We walked upstairs. The shorter man paused near the exit. One final question. "Have you discussed the missing edition with anyone?" "No." Again, relief. The answer clearly mattered. The shorter man nodded. "Excellent." Then both men left. I watched through the front windows. The black sedan waited at the curb. No visible license plate, no dealership logo, no manufacturer emblem, nothing. The men got inside. The vehicle drove away. That evening I stayed late, mostly because curiosity refused to leave me alone. After closing, I returned to the basement. I wanted to see the reel again. The cabinet stood exactly where it always had. I opened the drawer. The reel was gone. Not misplaced. Gone. I checked every shelf, every cabinet, nothing. The archive catalog still listed it. The physical reel had vanished. I searched for over an hour. No luck. Eventually I gave up. The next morning I arrived early. The reel sat exactly where it belonged. Same cabinet, same label, like it had never left. I loaded it into the reader immediately. The film rolled. August 13th, August 14th. There it was again. The missing issue. The article remained. So did the photographs. 3 grainy black and white images. I hadn't seen them before. The first showed lights over the water. The second showed several witnesses standing on a dock. The third stopped me cold. The image showed the library, not the modern library, the old library building that occupied the site before the current one was built. Standing near the entrance were 2 men in dark suits. The photograph had been taken in 1968. Yet the men looked exactly like the 2 who had visited me. Same faces, same expressions, same clothing. I stared at the image for a long time. Then the machine shut off again, just like before. The bulb went dark. The room fell silent. When the machine restarted, August 14th was gone. The photographs were gone. The issue no longer existed. I checked the reel repeatedly. Nothing. Only August 13 and August 15th. That afternoon, I searched for the original email request. The message had disappeared. Not deleted. Gone. No record remained in the system. No sender. No archive. Nothing. I checked server logs with help from our IT volunteer. No trace. It was as if the request had never been sent. A week later, I found a folded newspaper clipping tucked inside a book returned to the library. No envelope, no note. Just the clipping. The date at the top read August 14, 1968. The article had been cut out. Only the photograph remained. The library. The 2 suited men. And written across the back in faded pencil were 5 words. No second requests received. I saw the light at 11:46 p.m. from the parking lot of a motel called the Cedar Ridge Inn. The motel sat along a 2-lane highway outside Salmon, Idaho. I was driving home from a construction job in Montana and had decided to stop for the night rather than push through another 4 hours of mountain roads. The place was exactly what you'd expect from a rural roadside motel. 20 or so rooms, a small office, a vending machine that hummed louder than it should have. A breakfast room with 4 tables. Nothing remarkable. The weather had been clear all day, but by nightfall, a cold wind had started moving through the valley. The sky remained cloudless. You could see stars from horizon to horizon. After checking in, I grabbed dinner in town and returned around 11. I wasn't tired yet. I'd been sitting in a truck for most of the day and needed to stretch my legs. So I walked around the edge of the parking lot. The motel sat on a slight rise overlooking open fields and distant hills. Beyond those hills were miles of forest and mountains. I remember stopping near an old wooden fence and looking out at the valley. That's when I noticed the light. At first I thought it was a tower beacon. Then I realized it wasn't blinking. The light hovered above the hills, not directly overhead, far away, maybe several miles, maybe more. Distance at night is difficult to judge. It looked white, bright but not painfully bright, just a steady glow. I stood there for a while watching it. The strange thing wasn't that it hovered. Helicopters exist. Drones exist. Aircraft can appear stationary under certain conditions. The strange thing was how perfectly still it remained. The light didn't drift, didn't wobble, didn't flash, didn't move at all. It simply hung there. I checked my phone. No service. The valley was notorious for that. I considered recording the light, but decided not to bother. Honestly, I wasn't thinking UFOs. I was thinking weather balloon, survey helicopter, something normal. After maybe 5 minutes, the light dimmed slightly, not disappeared, dimmed. Then it brightened again. The process repeated several times, like someone slowly turning a dial. Then without warning, it vanished. Not shot away, not dropped behind the hills, vanished. 1 second it was there. The next it wasn't. The sky became empty. I stood there another few minutes. Nothing returned. Eventually I went back to my room. Room 12. I remember that specifically because it becomes important later. The room itself was ordinary. 2 beds, television, small bathroom, the sort of place you forget immediately after leaving. I watched television for maybe half an hour before falling asleep. Sometime during the night I woke up, not fully, just enough to notice a sound outside, a car door closing. I checked the clock, 3:09 a.m. Then I rolled over and went back to sleep. The next morning, I woke around 7. The sky was overcast. The wind had picked up. Breakfast ended at 8:30, so I got dressed and headed toward the breakfast room. The moment I walked inside, I knew something felt wrong. Only 3 people sat in the room, an older couple near the window, and 2 men at a table near the coffee machine. Dark suits, dark ties, polished black shoes, one tall and thin, one shorter and broader. Neither looked like tourists, neither looked like travelers. Both looked completely out of place in a rural motel. The shorter man smiled when I entered, not a casual smile, a deliberate one, like he'd been waiting. I ignored it and grabbed coffee. Then I heard him speak. Room 12. Not loudly, just enough. The taller man nodded. My stomach tightened immediately. I turned. The 2 men weren't looking at me. They were looking at each other. The taller man opened a notebook. The shorter man noticed me watching. His smile widened slightly. I sat at the far end of the room, trying not to stare, trying not to overthink it. Maybe they'd heard my room number from staff. Maybe they'd checked in nearby. Maybe there was a normal explanation. Still felt strange. The motel was nearly empty. I hadn't seen either man the previous evening. I hadn't seen them checking in. I hadn't seen their vehicle. A few minutes later, the shorter man stood and approached my table. "Good morning." I nodded cautiously. "Morning." He sat down without being invited. The taller man remained at the other table, watching. The shorter man smiled. "You observed something unusual last night." Not a question. My stomach dropped. "What?" "The light." I stared at him. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, I said, "Who are you?" "Travel assessment." The answer made no sense. The man didn't seem bothered by that. He continued smiling. I glanced toward the taller man. The notebook remained open, pen ready, waiting. The shorter man asked, "How long did you observe it?" "A few minutes." The taller man began writing. The shorter one nodded. "Did it move?" "No." Another note. "Did it produce sound?" "No." The notebook continued filling. I looked around the room. The older couple appeared completely uninterested. The motel employee behind the counter wasn't paying attention either. The whole situation felt bizarrely normal, like nobody else noticed how strange it was. Finally, I asked, "How do you know what room I'm staying in?" The shorter man paused. For the first time, his smile weakened. Then he said, "You are staying in room 12." Not an answer, just a repetition. I laughed nervously. "Yeah, I know that." He simply nodded. The conversation moved on. Did the light appear mechanical? What does that mean? No interpretation is necessary. That wasn't helpful. The questions continued. Brightness, color, direction, duration, nothing particularly alarming. Yet something about the man's behavior bothered me. Not what he asked, how he asked. Every question sounded memorized, like he'd learned the correct sequence without understanding why. Then came the oddest question. Were there others present during observation? I thought about it. The parking lot had been empty. No. The shorter man looked relieved, actually relieved. The taller man stopped writing momentarily. The 2 exchanged a glance. Something about my answer mattered. A lot. I finally asked again, "Who are you guys?" The shorter man ignored the question. Instead, he asked, "Did you notice any additional lights?" No. Any sounds? No. Any people nearby? No. More relief. The notebook closed. The interview appeared finished. Then the shorter man asked one final thing. "Did the light seem aware of you?" I laughed because the question sounded ridiculous. The man didn't laugh. Neither did his partner. The silence lasted long enough to become uncomfortable. Eventually I answered, "No." The shorter man nodded. "Good." There was that word again. Good, as though I'd passed another test. The 2 men stood. The shorter one thanked me. The taller one tucked away the notebook. Then they left the breakfast room. I waited a few seconds and followed. Curiosity had completely replaced caution at that point. The motel parking lot sat directly outside. I expected to see a black sedan or an SUV or something. Instead, I saw nothing. The lot contained only 4 vehicles, mine. The older couple's sedan, a pickup truck, and a delivery van. No black car, no sign of the 2 men, no vehicle pulling away. Nothing. I walked around the building, checked both sides. Empty. The men had simply disappeared from view in the few seconds between leaving the breakfast room and me reaching the door. I went to the front desk. The same employee from breakfast was working. A woman named Carla, according to her name tag. I asked if she knew the two men. She looked confused. What two men? The guys in the breakfast room. There wasn't anybody else in there. I actually laughed. Yeah, there was. She shook her head. Just you and the Hendersons. The older couple. I stared at her. She stared back, completely serious. I dropped the subject, paid for an extra coffee, returned to my room. Something felt wrong, not dangerous, just wrong. Before checking out, I looked through the curtains toward the parking lot. Nothing unusual. Then I noticed something sitting on the desk beside the television. A folded piece of paper. I hadn't seen it before. Maybe housekeeping, maybe motel information. I opened it. The page contained a simple hand-drawn map. No labels, no title, just a rough sketch of hills, fields, roads, and a small circle. The circle marked the exact location where I'd seen the light. I knew because the hills matched the view from the parking lot. At the bottom of the page, someone had written 4 words. Observation remained unreciprocated. That was it. No signature, no explanation. I took the paper with me, mostly because I wanted to figure out who left it. During checkout, I asked Carla if anyone had entered my room. She said no. The room keys were old-fashioned metal keys attached to plastic tags. No electronic logs. No way to verify. I drove home and tried to forget about the entire thing. A week later, I found the paper inside my glove compartment, not where I'd left it. I'd originally stored it in a folder at home. Now it sat folded inside my truck. I unfolded it again. The map remained unchanged. The sentence remained unchanged. But something new had been added. A second line beneath the first. Same handwriting, same black ink. Observation. Did not notice observers. I never figured out who wrote it or how it got there. A month later, I drove through the area again for work. The motel still stood. The breakfast room still existed. Carla still worked the front desk. I asked about room 12. She told me something strange. According to the records, nobody had occupied room 12 the night I stayed there. The room had been closed for maintenance. When I reminded her that I'd literally slept there, she apologized and said the records must be wrong. Then she showed me the maintenance log. Room 12 had supposedly been locked for 3 days, including the night I'd checked in. Before leaving, I walked to the end of the parking lot where I'd first seen the light. The hills remained exactly the same. The valley remained exactly the same. Nothing unusual stood out. Then I noticed a weathered wooden post near the fence. Someone had carved numbers into it. At first I assumed they were random. Then I realized they weren't. They matched the date of my stay. Directly beneath the numbers sat 2 initials, not names, just initials. One tall and narrow, one short and compact, as if 2 different people had carved them. And below both was a single line scratched into the wood. Still no visual contact. The passenger got into my cab at 1:18 in the morning during a light snowfall in northern Wisconsin. I remember the exact time because I just checked the dashboard clock while sitting at a red light. It was late January. The roads were wet. Most people had already gone home. I was finishing what I expected would be my last fare of the night. The pickup came through dispatch from a small gas station on the edge of town. Nothing unusual. I accepted the ride and headed over. The gas station sat alone beside a stretch of highway surrounded by dark woods. A few trucks were parked near the pumps. The convenience store remained open 24 hours. When I pulled in, I expected someone waiting near the entrance. Nobody was there. I checked the ride information again. Correct address. I was about to call dispatch when the rear passenger door opened. The man had appeared beside the car without me noticing. That bothered me immediately. Not because it was impossible, just because I normally notice people approaching, especially at night. The man slid into the back seat and closed the door quietly. No luggage, no backpack, no coat despite the cold, just a dark suit. Not a business suit exactly. Something about it looked slightly old-fashioned. His hair was dark, neatly combed, maybe mid-40s, maybe older. It was difficult to tell. I asked where he was headed. He gave me an address on the far side of town. Then he stopped talking. The entire exchange lasted maybe 5 seconds. I pulled away from the gas station. For the first few minutes, everything seemed normal. Then I noticed what he was doing. He wasn't looking forward, wasn't checking his phone, wasn't staring out the side windows. He was looking upward, straight upward, his head tilted back toward the roof of the cab. His eyes remained fixed on the night sky visible through the windows, not occasionally, continuously. I watched him through the rearview mirror. The behavior felt strange enough that I remember thinking about it immediately. Most passengers look at their phones, or out the windows, or fall asleep. This man spent the entire ride watching the sky. The snowfall had mostly stopped by then. Clouds moved overhead. Occasionally, patches of stars became visible. Every time they did, the passenger seemed more focused, more attentive, like he was looking for something. About 10 minutes into the ride, I tried making conversation. Cold night. No response. I glanced in the mirror. His eyes remained fixed upward. I thought maybe he hadn't heard me. Supposed to snow again tomorrow. Nothing. Not rude. Not dismissive. Almost as if he genuinely hadn't noticed I'd spoken. That made me uncomfortable. Not scared. Just uneasy. Eventually, I stopped trying. The roads became quieter as we approached the residential part of town. The passengers still hadn't moved. Then something odd happened. At approximately 1:31 a.m., every streetlight along one section of road went dark. Not one light, all of them, a stretch of maybe half a mile. The lights shut off simultaneously. The road ahead disappeared into darkness. I slowed down, assumed it was a power issue. The passenger finally reacted, not by looking at the road, not by speaking. He smiled, just slightly, still staring upward. The lights returned maybe 20 seconds later. Everything appeared normal again. I remember checking the mirror. The smile had vanished. The man continued watching the sky. A few minutes later, we reached his destination. An older neighborhood near the edge of town. The address corresponded to a small house. Dark windows, no vehicles in the driveway, no porch light. I parked, turned around. That'll be 2350. The back seat was empty. For a moment, I genuinely thought I was losing my mind. The man was gone. No sound, no door opening, nothing. Just gone. I immediately checked both sides of the street. Nobody walking away, nobody crossing a yard, nobody. The rear door remained closed. I got out and looked around. The neighborhood sat completely silent. Fresh snow covered everything. No footprints, not even a single set leading away from the cab. I stood there for several minutes trying to understand what had happened. Eventually, I convinced myself the passenger must have exited while I was focused on the road. Maybe I simply missed it. People zone out while driving. It wasn't impossible. Still felt wrong. I finished my shift and went home. The next morning, I woke around 10. By noon, I'd mostly stopped thinking about it. Then somebody knocked on my apartment door. 2 men stood outside. Dark suits. Dark ties. Polished shoes. One tall and thin, one shorter and broader. The sight immediately reminded me of the passenger. Not because they looked identical, because they felt similarly out of place. The shorter man smiled politely. "Mr. Nathan Reeves?" I nodded. Neither offered identification. Neither introduced themselves. The shorter man spoke again. "We'd like to ask about a passenger." My stomach tightened. What passenger? The individual collected at approximately 1:18 a.m. That got my attention instantly. I hadn't reported the fare, hadn't discussed it, hadn't even contacted dispatch. Yet they knew the exact time. The shorter man continued. "We understand there may have been unusual circumstances." I stared at him. Neither man appeared threatening, yet something felt deeply off. I invited them inside, mostly because I wanted answers. The conversation started normally enough. Pickup location, destination, duration of ride, standard questions. Then it became strange. The shorter man asked, did he appear aware of his surroundings? What does that mean? Was he attentive? I guess. The taller man wrote notes. The shorter man nodded. Then came another question. Did he spend significant time observing the sky? I froze. The 2 men watched carefully. Yeah. The taller man immediately wrote something down. The shorter man seemed relieved. Actually relieved. Like my answer confirmed something. Then he asked, did he mention lights? No. Stars? No. Movement overhead? No. The relief faded slightly. The taller man continued writing. I finally interrupted. Who are you guys? The shorter man smiled. Transit review. The answer sounded ridiculous, not even close to a real explanation. The questioning continued. Had the passenger seemed frightened? No. Confused? No. Aggressive? No. Then the shorter man asked something that caught me completely off guard. What color were his eyes? I blinked. What? His eyes. That question seemed more important than anything else they'd asked. The taller man stopped writing entirely, waiting. The shorter man leaned forward slightly. I thought back, tried to remember. The truth was simple. I don't know. The disappointment was immediate. Both men visibly deflated. Not dramatically, just enough to notice, like I'd failed to provide something important. The shorter man asked again, "Any estimate?" No. I genuinely couldn't remember. The entire ride he'd been looking upward. I never got a clear look at his eyes. The taller man wrote a few final notes. The shorter man sat quietly for several seconds. Then he asked, "Did he blink?" I laughed. Not because it was funny, because the question sounded absurd. Neither man laughed. I stopped immediately. I don't know. Another disappointing answer. The questioning continued for nearly 20 minutes. Every detail seemed secondary to the passenger's eyes. Color, movement, focus, blinking direction. The more they asked, the stranger it felt. Eventually I mentioned something. The streetlights, the section that went dark. That immediately got their attention. The taller man flipped to a fresh page. The shorter man asked for the exact location. I told him. Both men exchanged a look. The same look I'd seen several times during the interview. Recognition. Not surprise. Recognition. Like they already knew. The shorter man asked one final question. Did he look at the lights when they failed? I thought about it. The answer was no. The passenger hadn't looked at them, hadn't reacted. He kept watching the sky. When I told them that, both men became quiet, very quiet. The taller man closed his notebook. The interview appeared finished. The shorter man stood, then paused. Did you happen to inspect the rear seat afterward? What? After he departed. No. The man nodded slowly, then both visitors thanked me and left. I watched from the window as they crossed the parking lot. A black sedan waited outside. No license plate, no manufacturer badge, no visible markings. The two men got inside. The vehicle drove away. That should have been the end. Instead, curiosity got the better of me. I went downstairs, unlocked my cab, and checked the rear seat. Nothing obvious appeared at first. Then I noticed moisture on the upholstery, not spilled liquid, condensation, a narrow strip running across the seat, as if something cold had rested there. I touched it, still damp, which made no sense. The passenger had been in the vehicle nearly 12 hours earlier. The moisture should have evaporated long ago. I cleaned it and moved on. Or tried to. That evening, I contacted dispatch. Mostly out of curiosity, I wanted information about the pickup request. The dispatcher sounded confused. There was no record of it. Not deleted. Not canceled. No record at all. According to their system, I hadn't received a fare from that gas station. The time slot showed empty. I argued for several minutes. Eventually, they checked manually. Nothing. No call. No ride. No passenger. The fare simply didn't exist. The next few days remained normal. Mostly. Then I noticed something in my dashcam footage. The camera recorded both road and interior views. I reviewed the ride. The passenger appeared exactly as I remembered. Silent. Watching the sky. The recording continued normally until the streetlights failed. Then the interior camera glitched. Only briefly. Maybe 2 seconds. When the image returned, the passenger had changed position. Not dramatically, just enough. His face now pointed directly toward the camera. For the first time during the ride, I paused the footage, zoomed in. The image quality wasn't great. Dark conditions, compression artifacts. Still, I could see his eyes clearly. Or at least I thought I could. The strange thing was that they appeared closed, completely closed. Yet his face remained tilted toward the sky, as though he was still watching something. I replayed the footage several times, same result every time. Then I noticed another detail, the timestamp. For those 2 missing seconds, the clock jumped ahead nearly 3 minutes. No explanation, no recording interruption, just missing time. The next morning, I found an envelope tucked beneath my apartment door. No stamp, no address, nothing. Inside sat a single photograph, a still image from my dash cam, the passenger, looking upward. The photo had been printed at much higher quality than my original footage, sharp enough to reveal details I couldn't see before. His eyes weren't closed, they were open, very open, staring upward. And written on the back of the photograph were 6 words. Eye color not successfully confirmed. I discovered the missing footage during a foggy morning patrol in the Olympic National Forest. I'd been a park ranger for almost 8 years by then. Most of my work involved trail maintenance, visitor assistance, search and rescue support, and monitoring wildlife activity. The section of forest I covered wasn't particularly remote by local standards, but once you got a few miles off the main roads, it felt isolated enough. The weather had been strange all week. Not stormy, just unsettled. Heavy fog rolled through every morning and lingered longer than usual. Some days, visibility dropped to less than 50 yards. The trail cameras were part of a wildlife monitoring project we'd been running for years. Motion-activated units mounted throughout the forest recorded animal movement along migration routes. Every Monday, I checked them, downloaded footage, changed batteries, routine stuff. That particular Monday started normally. The first camera contained dozens of clips: deer, coyotes, a black bear, nothing unusual. The second camera was the same. The third camera showed normal activity until exactly 1:43 a.m. on Saturday. Then the recordings stopped. No error messages, no damage, just empty storage. I figured the memory card had failed. Then I checked the fourth camera, same thing, normal footage, then nothing after 1:43 a.m. The fifth camera matched, so did the sixth. By lunchtime, I'd checked 8 cameras spread across nearly 4 miles of forest. Every one of them stopped recording at exactly 1:43 a.m. Everyone resumed normal operation around 3:12 a.m., nearly 90 minutes missing. That immediately got my attention. Equipment failures happen, but 8 cameras failing simultaneously was something else, especially when they weren't connected to each other. Different batteries, different memory cards, different locations, yet all showed the exact same gap. I spent most of the afternoon inspecting them. No vandalism, no water damage, no signs of tampering. Everything appeared normal. The forest itself seemed normal too, at least initially. Then I started noticing small things. A herd of elk standing unusually close to a trailhead, 3 owls sitting together in broad daylight, a fox that simply stood beside the trail watching me. None of those things were impossible. Animals behave unpredictably. Still, after years in the woods, you develop a sense for when something feels off. The forest felt off. Not dangerous, just different. That night, I reviewed the footage again from my office. The missing period remained identical across every camera. 1:43 a.m., then nothing. 3:12 a.m., then normal activity resumed. Around midnight, I finally headed home. The next morning, I drove back into the forest to inspect several cameras I'd missed. The fog was thick, heavy enough that the trees faded into white walls only a short distance away. Everything felt quiet. Even the birds seemed subdued. I parked near a trail junction and started hiking. About 20 minutes later, I reached camera 9. Same issue, normal footage. Then a gap, then normal footage again. As I stood there checking logs, I heard footsteps behind me. Not close, maybe 30 feet away. I assumed another ranger had come out to assist. When I turned around, 2 men stood on the trail. I hadn't heard them approach. That bothered me immediately. The forest floor was covered in wet leaves and branches. People made noise out there. These 2 hadn't. Both wore dark suits, dark ties, polished shoes, not hiking boots, not outdoor clothing. Suits, in the middle of a fog-covered forest. The sight felt absurd. One man was tall and thin, the other shorter and broader. Both appeared perfectly clean despite the muddy conditions. The shorter man smiled politely. "Good morning." I nodded cautiously. Neither offered identification, neither introduced themselves. The taller man carried a small notebook. I asked if they were lost. The shorter man shook his head. "We were hoping to ask a few questions." That immediately raised alarms. "What kind of questions?" The 2 men exchanged a brief look. Then the shorter one asked, "Have animals behaved unusually since Saturday?" Not who they were, not why they were there. Straight to the question. I stared at him. "What?" "Wildlife." The taller man opened his notebook. The shorter man continued. "Any changes in behavior?" The question felt strangely specific. I told him about the elk, the fox, the owls. The taller man wrote everything down. The shorter man nodded thoughtfully. Then he asked, "Any aggression?" "No." "Fear responses?" "No." "Disorientation?" I frowned. "Not that I've seen." That answer seemed to relieve them. The taller man stopped writing. The shorter man nodded. "Good." That word again. "Good." The same way someone reacts when hearing positive medical results. I asked who they worked for. The shorter man smiled. "Field assessment." Not a company, not an agency, just 2 words. The answer irritated me. What does that mean? Neither responded. Instead, the taller man asked, "Did you review the recordings?" I felt my stomach tighten. "How do you know about the cameras?" The question hung in the air. Neither answered. The shorter man simply asked, "Did you observe anything unusual in the footage?" I explained the missing time, the synchronized gaps, the strange timing. The men listened carefully. Neither looked surprised, not even slightly, almost as if they'd expected it. The taller man wrote more notes. The shorter one nodded occasionally. Then came another strange question. Were any animals present immediately before the interruption? I thought back. Actually, yes. Several cameras had captured deer shortly before the recording stopped. I told them. Again, more notes. The conversation continued for several minutes. Every question focused on wildlife, not the cameras. Not equipment failures. Animals. Had birds changed migration patterns? Had predators altered routes? Had animals avoided specific areas? The questions felt oddly rehearsed, like someone working from a script. Eventually, I asked the obvious question. Why are you interested in the animals? The shorter man paused. For the first time, he seemed unsure. Then he said, behavioral indicators. That explained absolutely nothing. The taller man suddenly looked toward the trees. Not casually, intently, like he'd heard something. The shorter man noticed too. Both men remained silent, listening. I listened as well. Nothing, just distant wind. After several seconds, they relaxed. The moment passed, but it left me unsettled. The interview eventually ended, or so I thought. Then the shorter man asked one final question. Did any animals approach the cameras after recordings resumed? I remembered something. A deer appeared in footage from camera 4 less than a minute after the recording returned. The animal stood directly in front of the lens, motionless, staring into it, for nearly 3 minutes. I mentioned this. The reaction was immediate. The taller man's pen stopped moving. The shorter man's smile disappeared entirely. Not fear, concern, genuine concern. 3 minutes, he asked. Approximately. The two men exchanged another look. Something about that answer clearly mattered. A lot. Eventually the shorter man nodded. Thank you. Then both men turned and walked down the trail. No goodbye, no explanation, just left. I watched them disappear into the fog. A few seconds later, I followed. Curiosity got the better of me. The trail stretched ahead for several hundred yards. Empty. No movement. No sound. Nothing. The men were gone, completely. There was nowhere they could have vanished to that quickly. Dense brush bordered both sides of the trail, no side paths, no clearings. Yet they had disappeared. I spent several minutes searching before giving up. That evening, I returned to headquarters. Something about the entire encounter bothered me. Not enough to report, just enough to stick in my head. I reviewed additional footage, camera after camera, normal activity, then the gap, then normal activity again. Near midnight, I found something I hadn't noticed before. Camera 11, a unit mounted near a creek crossing. The recording resumed at 3:12 a.m. like all the others. For roughly 5 seconds, the lens pointed toward empty forest. Then an elk entered frame. The animal stopped instantly, not because of the camera. It stared at something beyond the edge of the image, something off-screen. The elk remained perfectly still, then slowly backed away. Not turned, backed away, as if unwilling to take its eyes off whatever it saw. The footage ended. I watched it several times. The behavior wasn't normal. The next day I returned to that location. The forest appeared ordinary. No tracks, no disturbances, nothing. Then I noticed something else. The ground around the camera showed almost no animal tracks. That should have been impossible. The area usually contained dozens. Deer, elk, coyotes. Instead, the soil looked strangely untouched, almost avoided. I checked nearby sections of trail. Tracks everywhere, but within roughly 50 yards of the camera, almost none. That evening, I received a call from another ranger named Mitchell. He sounded confused. One of the missing cameras had started recording without motion activation. Hours of empty forest, nothing moving, nothing triggering it, just continuous footage. We reviewed it together. The recording showed darkness, trees, fog, silence. Then near 1:43 a.m., every insect sound stopped, all at once. The forest became completely silent. No crickets, no frogs, nothing. The silence lasted exactly 9 seconds. Then the footage cut directly to 3:12 a.m. No transition, no glitch, just missing time. Mitchell sat there staring at the screen. Neither of us said much. The following week, the cameras worked normally. No missing footage, No strange gaps, no unusual behavior, everything returned to normal. Almost. 3 months later, I was hiking near Camera 9 again. The fog had returned, not as thick as before, just enough to blur distant trees. As I passed the camera location, I noticed fresh footprints in the mud. 2 sets. Dress shoe prints, not hiking boots, not ranger boots, dress shoes. The tracks approached the camera, stopped directly beneath it, then ended. No return prints, no continuation, just tracks leading to the camera and nowhere else. I stood there for a long time staring at them. The soil was soft enough that any departing footprints should have been obvious. There weren't any, only the approach. Later that afternoon, I checked the camera. The most recent image had been captured 30 minutes earlier. The frame showed empty forest, fog, trees, nothing unusual, except for 2 blurry figures standing behind the camera, visible only in the reflection of the protective lens housing, looking directly toward it, one tall, one shorter, and both appeared to be watching something deeper in the forest rather than the camera itself. I found the tape on a rainy Tuesday afternoon while cleaning out my attic. I had retired the year before after nearly 40 years working as a high school history teacher in rural Vermont. My wife and I had been slowly going through decades of accumulated boxes, old furniture, photo albums, and things we'd stored away and forgotten. The attic was the last major project. Most of what I found wasn't interesting. Christmas decorations, old tax records, my kids' school projects. Then I found a cardboard box with my father's handwriting on it. The box looked older than everything around it. Yellowed tape, faded marker, dust everywhere. My father, Walter Brennan, had died in 1998. I'd gone through most of his belongings years earlier, at least I thought I had. Inside the box were photographs, receipts, newspaper clippings, and a small cassette tape. The tape had a handwritten label, recorded 1987, for family only. That got my attention immediately. My father wasn't the sort of man who left mysterious messages. He was practical, quiet, a mechanic his entire life. The idea that he'd recorded something specifically for family members seemed unusual. I took the tape downstairs. It took me 2 days to find a cassette player that still worked. Eventually, I borrowed one from a neighbor. The recording lasted roughly 30 minutes. The first few minutes were normal. My father talking about family history, names, dates, stories about relatives. Then the tone changed. His voice became noticeably more serious, not frightened, just careful. He began describing something that had happened during the summer of 1967. At the time, he'd been 24 years old. He and 2 friends had been driving home late at night from a fishing trip near Lake Champlain. According to the recording, they saw unusual lights over a field. 3 lights. Silent. Motionless. Nothing dramatic. Nothing impossible. The story remained grounded and straightforward. No aliens, no spaceships, no claims of contact, just strange lights. Then came the part that caught my attention. My father described stopping the truck to get a better look. The lights disappeared. A few minutes later, they noticed a black car parked beside a rural road. 2 men stood near it, watching them. The men never approached, never spoke, just stood there. My father said something about them bothered him. Not because they were threatening, because they appeared to have been waiting. The story continued for another 10 minutes. Then he mentioned a date, or at least he almost did. The tape briefly cut out, just a second or two. When audio returned, the date was gone. The sentence sounded incomplete. I replayed it multiple times. Same result. The tape seemed damaged at that exact moment. Eventually, my father finished the story. According to him, nothing else happened. No encounters, no investigations, no dramatic conclusion. Just an experience he'd never fully understood. The recording ended. I sat there for a while thinking about it, mostly because it felt completely out of character. My father never talked about things like that, ever. I assumed that would be the end of it. Then small things started happening. Nothing major. Just odd. The following day I received a phone call. Nobody spoke when I answered. Just silence. Then the call disconnected. That happens. Wrong numbers exist. Telemarketers exist. I didn't think much about it. The next day it happened again. Same thing. Silence. Then a click. Then nothing. After the 3rd call, I started paying attention. Still not alarmed. Just curious. Around the same time, I noticed a dark sedan parked near the end of our road. Not every day, just occasionally. The vehicle never seemed to stay long, maybe 10 minutes, maybe 15. Then it would leave. Again, not especially alarming. People drive through neighborhoods. I would have forgotten about it if not for what happened 3 days later. Around noon, there was a knock at the door. I opened it expecting a delivery. Instead, I found two men standing on the porch. Dark suits, dark ties, polished shoes, one tall and thin, one shorter and broader. Both appeared perfectly dry despite the steady rain. The shorter man smiled. "Mr. Brennan?" I nodded. Neither introduced themselves, neither showed identification. The shorter man asked if they could ask a few questions. Immediately, I assumed they were selling something. Then he mentioned the tape. My stomach tightened, not because I felt threatened, because I genuinely didn't understand how they knew it existed. The men entered after I invited them inside. The conversation began politely. They asked whether I'd recently discovered personal recordings belonging to my father. I confirmed I had. The shorter man nodded. The taller man opened a notebook. Then came the question. Did the tape mention a specific date? Not the story, not the lights, not the encounter, the date. I told them I wasn't sure. The audio cut out briefly. The taller man stopped writing. The shorter man exchanged a glance with him, then asked again, "You're certain?" "Pretty sure." That answer seemed important, very important. The taller man wrote something down. The shorter man nodded slowly, then asked if I'd attempted to restore the damaged section. No. Another note. The questioning continued. Had I shared the tape, copied it, digitized it, played it for anyone else? The questions felt strangely focused. Everything revolved around the missing date, nothing else. Eventually I asked the obvious question. How did you know about the tape? The room became quiet. The shorter man smiled politely. The taller man continued staring at the notebook. Neither answered. I repeated the question. Same result. Silence. Not hostile silence, just complete refusal to acknowledge it. The conversation moved on as if I hadn't spoken. That bothered me more than anything else. Not because they wouldn't answer, because neither seemed uncomfortable refusing. They simply ignored the question. The interview continued for another 20 minutes. Eventually, the shorter man asked whether he could hear the recording. Against my better judgment, I agreed. I played the tape. Both men listened carefully. Neither took notes. Neither interrupted. The moment the damaged section approached, both men leaned slightly forward. Not dramatically, just enough to notice. Then the audio dropped out. The missing date vanished again. The recording continued. The two men relaxed immediately, almost as if they'd been waiting for that specific moment. The tape ended. Neither commented on the story itself. Instead, the shorter man asked, "Has the interruption always been present?" "Yes." The taller man finally spoke for the first time. "Good. One word." Nothing else. The two men stood shortly afterward. The conversation appeared finished. Then the shorter man paused near the front door. "Did your father ever discuss this incident in person?" "No. Never?" "Never." The answer seemed to satisfy him. Both men thanked me and left. I watched from the window. The rain continued falling. The sedan waited at the curb. The men got inside and drove away. No license plate was visible on the rear. At least none that I could see. That evening, I couldn't stop thinking about the missing date. Not the lights, not the strange men. The date. Why did it matter? The next morning, I decided to digitize the tape, mostly out of curiosity. I transferred the recording to my computer, cleaned the audio, reduced background noise, adjusted levels. The damaged section remained. Except now something felt different. The dropout lasted longer, not by much, maybe another second. I assumed I'd made a mistake during processing. I tried again. Same result. The missing section seemed larger. Over the next several days, I became mildly obsessed. I kept restoring the audio, running different filters, trying different software. The gap kept changing, sometimes shorter, sometimes longer, never consistently. One evening, I finally isolated a faint sound buried beneath the dropout. A voice. Not my father's. Not clear enough to identify. Just a few words. I spent hours trying to improve it. Eventually, I understood part of a sentence. Only part. Don't say the... Then static. Nothing else. The following week, I visited my father's younger brother, my Uncle Raymond. He was 84, still sharp, still living independently. I asked whether he'd ever heard the story. To my surprise, he immediately knew what I was talking about. Not the tape. The incident. His reaction caught me off guard. Apparently, my father had mentioned it once in the late 1970s. Only once. I asked whether he remembered a date. Raymond frowned, then became strangely quiet. After several seconds, he shook his head. No. The answer sounded rehearsed, not false exactly, practiced, as though he'd answered before. When I pressed further, he changed the subject. The conversation never returned to the tape. A month later, I received a package. No return address. Inside was a brand new cassette tape, completely blank. No label, no note, nothing. Just a cassette. I almost threw it away. Instead, I played it. The tape contained approximately 28 minutes of silence. Then, near the end, a single sentence, spoken by a man's voice I didn't recognize. Calm, clear, matter of fact. The voice said that was not the correct date. Then the tape ended. I took the photograph just after sunrise on a cold October morning in the Bitterroot Mountains of western Montana. The weather had been strange for days. Not dramatic, just unusually still. No wind, no rain. The kind of quiet weather photographers love because mountain lakes turn into mirrors. I was 32 at the time and worked mostly as a landscape photographer. Not famous, not making huge money. I sold prints, licensed images occasionally, and taught photography workshops during the summer. That morning I was alone. I'd left my truck before dawn and hiked nearly 2 miles to a small alpine lake called Carson Lake. The place wasn't particularly well known. No campground, no facilities, just a trail and a lake surrounded by steep timber-covered slopes. I arrived before sunrise and set up my tripod along the eastern shoreline. The water looked perfect, completely still, not a ripple anywhere. The mountains reflected so clearly, it was difficult to tell where the shoreline ended and the reflection began. For nearly an hour, I photographed the changing light. Nothing unusual happened, at least not while I was there. Around 8:15, I packed up and headed home. The photograph itself didn't catch my attention until later that afternoon. I was reviewing images in my studio when I noticed something odd in one frame. Not obvious, not immediately, just a tiny dark shape near the center of the lake. At first, I assumed it was debris, a floating log, a bird, something ordinary. The shape appeared only in one photograph. The images taken seconds before and after showed nothing. I zoomed in. The shape remained blurry, small, distant, strange. The odd part wasn't the object itself, it was where it appeared. The shape existed only in the reflection, not above the lake, not in the sky, only in the reflected image of the mountains. That caught my attention. If the object had truly been reflected in the water, something should have existed above it, something casting the reflection. There wasn't. I spent maybe 20 minutes trying to make sense of it. Then I moved on. Photography produces weird artifacts sometimes. Lens reflections, birds, dust, digital glitches. I figured it would make sense once I enlarged the file properly. I never got the chance. The next morning, 2 men visited my studio. The timing alone bothered me. I hadn't posted the image, hadn't shared it, hadn't mentioned it to anyone. The photograph existed only on my computer. Yet around 10 o'clock, there was a knock at my door. I opened it expecting a client. Instead, I found 2 men in dark suits standing outside. One was tall and thin, the other shorter and heavier. Both looked to be in their 40s. Both wore identical dark ties despite it being a casual mountain town where most people dressed in flannel and work boots. The shorter man smiled. "Miss Avery Cole?" I nodded. Neither introduced themselves, neither showed identification. The shorter man simply said they had questions regarding a photograph. Immediately my stomach tightened. I asked what photograph. The taller man answered, "The lake." That was all. The lake. Not Carson Lake. Not a landscape image. Just the lake. The fact they knew about it at all felt wrong. Still, curiosity won. I invited them inside. The conversation started politely enough. Where had I taken the photo? What time? What equipment? What weather conditions? Normal questions. At least initially. Then things shifted. The shorter man asked exactly where I'd been standing. I pointed to the lake on a map. He wanted more precision. I marked the shoreline. Not enough. He wanted the exact location. I eventually pulled up GPS metadata from the image. The taller man copied the coordinates carefully into a notebook. The shorter man nodded, then asked where my tripod had been positioned. Not the lake, not the photograph. The tripod. I showed him. Again, the information went into the notebook. The questioning continued. Which direction had I been facing? How tall was the tripod? Had I moved during the session? Had I stood anywhere else nearby? The questions felt strangely specific, almost obsessive. After 20 minutes, I finally asked why any of this mattered. The shorter man smiled. Verification. That explained nothing. The taller man continued writing. Eventually, I asked whether they wanted to see the photograph. Neither answered immediately. The shorter man finally shrugged. If you'd like. The response surprised me. They'd come all the way to my studio because of a photograph. Yet they seemed completely uninterested in seeing it. I opened the file anyway. The image appeared on my monitor. Both men looked. Neither reacted. No surprise, no curiosity, nothing. The shorter man leaned closer to the screen, not toward the object, toward the shoreline, specifically the spot where I'd been standing. Then he asked, "Were you alone?" "Yes." The taller man wrote something down. The shorter man nodded slowly. Again, the question seemed more important than the image itself. I enlarged the object, or tried to. The shape remained blurry, indistinct, a dark oval, nothing more. The men barely glanced at it. That was the moment things started feeling genuinely strange. Most people would have focused on the object. That was the unusual part. The men couldn't have cared less. Everything revolved around my location, my position, my angle, my exact placement beside the lake. Eventually, the shorter man asked, "Did you leave the shoreline during the session?" "No." "At any point?" "No." The taller man stopped writing. Both men exchanged a look, the first real reaction I'd seen from either of them. Not concern, relief. Small but unmistakable. Relief. The conversation continued another 15 minutes. Then the shorter man asked something unexpected. "Did you notice any sounds?" I frowned. "What kind of sounds?" "Anything unusual?" I thought about it. Actually, there had been something, a noise I'd mostly forgotten. Shortly before taking the photograph, I'd heard 3 faint metallic pops from somewhere across the lake. Not loud, not dramatic, just enough to notice. I mentioned it. The effect was immediate. The taller man looked up from the notebook. The shorter man's smile vanished. Both stared at me. Neither spoke for several seconds. Then the shorter man asked, 3? Maybe. Not 2? No. Not 4? No. The answer seemed important. Again, everything seemed important except the photograph. Eventually, the interview ended. The shorter man thanked me. The taller man closed his notebook. Both stood. Then the shorter man paused near the door. "One final question. Have you returned to the location since taking the photograph?" "No," he nodded. "Good." The words stuck with me. Good. Not because it sounded threatening, because it sounded sincere. Like he genuinely believed that was the correct answer. Then they left. I watched through the window. A black sedan sat parked outside. No visible license plates, no company logos, no government markings, nothing. The men drove away. I spent the rest of the afternoon replaying the conversation in my head. Something felt deeply wrong. Not dangerous. Wrong. That evening, I reopened the photograph. For the first time, I noticed something else. The image metadata looked unusual. Not altered. Just strange. The timestamp placed the photo at 7:18 a.m. I distinctly remembered taking it closer to 8. Nearly 40 minutes difference. I checked other images. Most matched my memory. That one didn't. I assumed I'd simply lost track of time. Then I noticed additional gaps. 3 photographs should have existed between 2 frames. They were gone. Not corrupted. Not hidden. Missing. The numbering jumped as though they'd never been taken. I searched backups, memory cards. Nothing. Those images simply didn't exist. The following weekend, curiosity got the better of me. I drove back to Carson Lake. The weather had turned colder. Thin ice formed near portions of the shoreline. The lake remained quiet, empty, ordinary. I walked to the exact spot where I'd taken the photograph, the same coordinates I'd shown the men. Standing there felt strangely uncomfortable, not because anything looked unusual, because everything looked normal, almost too normal. The shoreline, the trees, the mountains. Nothing stood out. Then I noticed footprints, not fresh, not recent, but preserved in a muddy section near the water. 2 sets, dress shoes. The tracks approached the shoreline, stopped, then turned back. I followed them. The footprints led into the trees. Eventually, they disappeared on rocky ground. No vehicle tracks, no campsite, nothing, just footprints. A week later, I received an envelope in the mail. No return address. Inside was a photograph. Not mine. An aerial photograph of Carson Lake. Old, black and white. Judging by the vehicles visible near an old logging road, maybe 1950s. A red circle had been drawn around a section of shoreline. the exact place where I'd been standing. Nothing else appeared in the envelope. No note, no explanation, just the photograph. I examined it for nearly an hour. Eventually, I noticed a date printed along the bottom edge, October 12th, 1958. Exactly 65 years before I'd taken my own photograph. In the circled area stood a small dark figure facing the lake, too distant to identify, too blurry to enlarge, and positioned in precisely the same spot where my tripod had been. The power went out for exactly 23 seconds. I know that because I checked the security logs afterward. At the time, though, it felt longer. I was working the overnight shift at a distribution warehouse outside Amarillo, Texas. The building sat by itself near an industrial access road surrounded by flat, empty land. During the day, the place was busy with trucks and forklifts. At night, it felt completely abandoned. I had worked security there for almost 3 years. Most nights were boring. Patrol the warehouse, watch cameras, check gates, fill out reports. Nothing exciting ever happened. The night of the outage started normally. It was late August, hot even after midnight. The air outside felt heavy. No wind, no clouds, just a clear sky and heat lingering off the pavement. Around 1:15 a.m., I was sitting in the security office watching camera feeds when my phone buzzed. A text from my friend Kyle. "You seeing these lights?" That was the entire message. I texted back asking what he meant. No response. A few minutes later, another message arrived. "West side of town." I figured he was talking about aircraft, or maybe weather balloons. People reported strange lights all the time. I didn't think much about it. Then the cameras flickered. Just once. A quick blink. Every monitor in front of me flashed black for a split second. Then everything returned. I checked the feeds. Normal. The warehouse remained empty. Outside, the parking lot lights glowed steadily. I went back to paperwork. About 10 minutes later, I noticed something strange. The outdoor cameras looked brighter, not dramatically, just enough to catch my attention. The west-facing cameras showed an odd glow near the horizon. At first, I thought it was distant lightning. Except there were no clouds. I switched the image to full screen. The glow remained, not moving, not flashing, just hanging there. A pale white light low above the horizon. Maybe 10 seconds later, it vanished. Not faded, vanished. The image returned to normal. I stared at the monitor for a while. Nothing else happened. Then the power died. Every light in the building shut off simultaneously. The monitors went black. The air conditioning stopped. Everything disappeared. The darkness felt surprisingly complete. For a moment, I could hear nothing except my own breathing. Then the emergency lighting activated. A dim red glow filled the hallway outside the office. 23 seconds later, the power returned. Computers rebooted. Monitors flickered back on. Everything appeared normal. At least initially. I walked the building. No damage, no alarms, no signs of intrusion. The outage seemed routine. Power failures happened. The rest of the shift remained quiet. Around sunrise, I headed home. The strange light had already slipped from my mind. That changed later that afternoon. I woke up around noon and checked local news. Several residents had reported unusual lights west of town around the same time as the outage. Nobody seemed certain what they'd seen. Some described hovering lights, others mentioned a bright glow. Nothing dramatic, nothing conclusive. Still, the timing matched. I found that interesting, nothing more. The following night, I arrived for my next shift. As soon as I entered the security office, my supervisor, Rick, looked up from his desk. "Two guys asked about you," I laughed. "What guys?" Rick shrugged. "Suits." That immediately sounded strange. Nobody wore suits around our warehouse. Not clients, not drivers, nobody. What'd they want? "They'll be back." That was apparently the entire explanation. Around 9:30 p.m., they arrived. I saw them pull into the parking lot through the office window. Black sedan, dark windows, no company markings. Two men stepped out, dark suits, dark ties, Polish shoes. One tall and thin, one shorter and broader. The sight immediately felt wrong. Not threatening, just wrong. The shorter man smiled politely when they entered. "Mr. Ethan Brooks," I nodded. Neither introduced themselves, neither showed identification. The shorter man asked if we could speak privately. Rick looked at me. I looked at Rick. Neither of us understood what was happening. Still, we moved into a small conference room. The conversation began with questions about the outage. Had I noticed anything unusual beforehand? Any sounds, any equipment failures, had alarms activated? Normal enough. Then the questions changed. The shorter man asked, "Did any clocks display incorrect times afterward?" I frowned. "What?" "Clocks." The taller man opened a notebook. The shorter man repeated the question. "Did any clocks display incorrect times?" Of all the things they could have asked about, that wasn't what I expected. I told them I hadn't checked. The taller man wrote something down. The shorter man nodded, then asked, "Digital or analog?" "What?" "The clocks." I stared at him. "I don't know." The disappointment was immediate, not dramatic, just visible. The taller man kept writing. The shorter man continued. "Were there clocks present in the warehouse?" "Yeah." "How many?" I honestly had no idea. Maybe 20, maybe 30. The exact number seemed impossible to care about, yet the men cared deeply. For nearly 15 minutes, they asked questions about clocks. Not the outage, not the lights. Clocks, digital clocks, wall clocks, microwave clocks, timestamps, security system timers, everything related to time. Eventually I interrupted. "Why does that matter?" The shorter man smiled. "Verification." The same kind of vague answer people give when they don't want to explain something. The questioning continued. Then he asked something that caught me off guard. "Did you personally observe the outage begin?" "Yes." "Were you looking at a clock when it happened?" "No." Again, visible disappointment. The taller man stopped writing for a moment, then resumed. "I noticed something strange. Every answer about clocks seemed important. Every answer about the lights seemed secondary. At one point, I even brought up the reports from town. The men barely reacted. The shorter man simply asked, after the outage, did any clocks require adjustment? Not, what did you see? Not, did you observe lights? Back to clocks. The obsession felt bizarre. Eventually, the interview ended, or so I thought. Then the shorter man asked one final question. Did any timepiece display a gain or loss exceeding 3 minutes? I shook my head. I have no idea. The taller man closed his notebook. The shorter man sighed quietly, not frustrated, more like concerned. Then they thanked me and left. I watched through the window as they walked to the sedan. Neither spoke, neither looked around. They simply got in and drove away. After they left, curiosity got the better of me. I started checking clocks. The office wall clock matched my phone. So did the microwave. So did the computer systems. Nothing appeared unusual. Then I reached the break room. A cheap, battery-powered wall clock hung above the vending machines. The clock showed 1:38. The actual time was 9:47. The battery hadn't died. The second hand still moved normally, just 8 hours off. I laughed when I saw it, figured someone forgot to reset it. Then I checked maintenance records. The clock had been replaced 3 weeks earlier. Nobody reported problems. Nobody adjusted it. Nothing. I kept looking. A digital clock in an unused loading area showed the wrong time too. Not by minutes, by hours. A third clock near receiving displayed a completely different time altogether. Suddenly I understood why the men had asked. Not because the clocks were wrong, because nobody had noticed. The next few days became increasingly strange. As I walked the warehouse, I started finding more clocks displaying different times. Not broken, running, keeping time, just not the correct time. The differences varied wildly. 2 hours, 5 hours, 9 hours. One clock showed a date 3 days earlier. Maintenance couldn't explain it. Neither could IT. Eventually, management replaced most of them. Problem solved, or so we assumed. About 2 weeks later, I was reviewing archive security footage from the night of the outage, mostly out of curiosity. The timestamps immediately caught my attention. Several camera feeds disagreed with each other, not by seconds, by minutes. One loading dock camera skipped ahead nearly 4 minutes immediately after the outage. Another lost 6 minutes. A third gained 2. The discrepancies existed only during that specific window. Then everything returned to normal. I reported it. Nobody seemed particularly concerned. Technical issues happen. Software glitches happen. Reasonable explanations existed. Still, something bothered me. I reviewed footage from the exact moment the power failed. Frame by frame, the outage occurred at 1:28 a.m., or at least that's what most cameras showed. One camera disagreed. A west-facing camera overlooking the parking lot showed 1:32. 4 minutes later, the image itself appeared normal, except for one thing. Just before the power cut out, 2 figures stood at the edge of the parking lot. Dark suits, watching the building. I zoomed in. The image quality wasn't great, but I recognized them immediately. The same two men, standing there the night before they'd ever officially visited. Both appeared to be looking upward rather than at the warehouse. Then the power failed. The footage ended. When recording resumed, 23 seconds later, the parking lot was empty. No figures, no vehicle, nothing. I checked every other camera angle, no sign of them arriving, no sign of them leaving, only that single brief appearance. A few months later, I found something tucked inside a filing cabinet while reorganizing old paperwork, a maintenance report. Dated the morning after the outage. I'd never seen it before. The report listed every clock inside the warehouse. Next to each clock, someone had written a time discrepancy. Handwritten, careful, precise. At the bottom of the page appeared two signatures. Neither belonged to anyone who worked there. And beneath the signatures, someone had written, all devices accounted for except one. No clock number followed, no explanation, just those 6 words. The knocking started on the 4th night. I was restoring an abandoned radio tower outside Silver Ridge, Montana, about 30 miles from the nearest town. It sat on top of a wooded hill overlooking miles of empty ranch land and forest. The tower itself had been built sometime in the early 1950s and hadn't been operational for decades. The local historical society had hired me to help stabilize the structure and document what remained before weather finished destroying it. I'd done similar projects before. Old fire lookouts, weather stations, communication towers. Most were isolated, most were creepy after dark. This one felt different. Not immediately, just gradually. The tower stood about 100 feet tall with a small concrete equipment building at its base. The building had no power, no running water, and only a few broken windows that had been boarded up years earlier. I spent my days cataloging equipment, photographing structural damage, and removing debris. Nothing unusual. The first 3 nights were quiet, cold but quiet. The 4th night was rainy. Not heavy rain, just a steady drizzle that turned everything damp and slippery. I stayed later than usual because I was trying to finish inventorying equipment inside the old transmitter room. Around 9:40 p.m., I heard the first knock, 3 sharp impacts. Knock, knock, knock. It sounded metallic, loud enough that I looked up immediately. At first, I assumed something had blown loose on the tower. The wind had picked up. Old structures make noise. I ignored it. Then it happened again. 3 knocks, same spacing, same volume. This time I stepped outside. The rain continued falling. The tower rose into darkness above me. Nothing moved. No vehicles, no people, just trees swaying in the wind. I listened for several minutes. Nothing. Eventually I went back inside. About 10 minutes later, it happened again. 3 knocks, exactly the same. The sound seemed to come from somewhere inside the tower itself, not from the building, not from the surrounding woods. The tower, like somebody striking metal with a hammer. I grabbed a flashlight and walked outside again. Still nothing. The sound stopped. The rest of the night remained quiet. I drove home around midnight. The next day I mentioned it to a local volunteer named Gus. He shrugged. Old towers make noise. Fair enough. That's what I thought too. Then it happened again the following night. This time there was no wind, no rain, clear skies. The temperature had dropped below freezing. Around 10:15 p.m. the knocking returned. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks, longer pause, then 3 more. I remember standing completely still while listening. Something about the timing felt deliberate, not random, not mechanical, intentional. I walked around the tower with my flashlight. Nothing. The sound stopped whenever I got close, then started again after I returned inside. That pattern repeated several times. Eventually I left. The following morning I inspected every visible section of the structure, loose panels, damaged braces, anything that could explain the noise. I found nothing. The tower remained solid, a little rusted, a little weathered, but structurally sound. That should have ended my interest. Instead, it made me more curious. Over the next several days, I began paying closer attention. The knocking occurred every night, not always at the same time, but always after dark, always from the tower, always in groups. Eventually, I noticed something else. The rhythm never changed. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks, longer pause, 3 knocks. Exactly the same every time. One evening, I decided to record it. I left an audio recorder running inside the equipment building. The knocking started shortly after 11 p.m. When I reviewed the recording later, the pattern sounded even stranger, not because of the knocks themselves, because of the precision. The timing between impacts remained nearly identical every time, almost like a signal. I wasn't a radio operator, but the thought crossed my mind, a signal. The idea seemed ridiculous. Still, once it entered my head, I couldn't shake it. The next night, I counted carefully. 3 knocks. Short pause. 3 knocks. Long pause. 3 knocks. I wrote everything down. Then something occurred to me. Years earlier, I'd learned basic Morse code while working with a search and rescue group. Not much, just enough to recognize common patterns. The rhythm felt familiar. Not the exact sequence, just the structure. The following evening, I sat in my truck with a notebook and listened again. This time, the pattern expanded. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks. Then several seconds later, another sequence, different this time. Shorter, almost like separate groups. I spent nearly an hour writing everything down. By midnight, I had several pages of notes. Back home, I compared the timing against Morse code charts. I wasn't expecting anything. Yet some portions lined up surprisingly well. Not enough to form words, just enough to bother me. I stopped looking. I told myself I was forcing patterns onto random sounds. People do that, especially when they're tired. A few days later, things became stranger. I arrived at the tower shortly before sunrise. The weather had turned foggy overnight, thick fog, the kind that swallows distance. As I unlocked the equipment building, I noticed footprints in the mud. 2 sets, dress shoes, not work boots, not hiking boots, dress shoes. The tracks circled the building once, then stopped near the tower base. No return tracks, no vehicle tracks, nothing. The footprints simply ended. I photographed them, mostly because they seemed odd. By afternoon, they had faded. Rain erased most of the details. That night, the knocking didn't happen. For the first time in nearly 2 weeks, instead something else happened. At approximately 11:20 p.m., every radio I carried began producing static. My truck radio, handheld receiver, even an old portable unit inside the building. Nothing but static. The interference lasted maybe 40 seconds, then everything returned to normal. No explanation. The knocking resumed the following night. 3 days later, the 2 men arrived. I was working inside the equipment building when I heard a car pull up. A black sedan. Dark windows, no front license plate. Maybe there was one on the back. I never checked. 2 men stepped out, dark suits, dark ties, polished shoes. Immediately wrong for the setting. One tall and thin, one shorter and broader. Both looked perfectly clean despite the muddy conditions. The shorter man smiled. Mr. Nolan Pierce? I nodded. Neither offered identification. Neither introduced themselves. The shorter man asked if we could speak privately. Something about the request immediately made me uneasy. Still, I agreed. The conversation began normally enough. Questions about the tower, its history, its condition. Then the topic shifted. The shorter man asked, "Have you noticed unusual sounds after sunset?" My stomach tightened slightly. Maybe. What kind of sounds? Knocking. The taller man immediately opened a notebook. The shorter one nodded. Neither looked surprised, not even slightly. The questions became increasingly specific. How many knocks? How often? What time? Did weather affect them? Had anyone else heard them? I answered as honestly as I could. The taller man filled several pages. Then came the question that changed everything. Did the sounds follow any recognizable pattern? The shorter man's tone remained calm, casual, almost conversational. I hesitated. Something told me the answer mattered. Actually, yes. The effect was immediate. The taller man stopped writing, completely. His pen froze above the page. The shorter man's smile vanished. Not dramatically. Just gone. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then they exchanged a look. Not surprise, not confusion, recognition. Like I'd confirmed something they'd hoped not to hear. The taller man slowly closed the notebook. No more notes, no more writing, nothing. The shorter man leaned forward slightly. What kind of pattern? I explained the repeating sequences, the timing, my attempts to compare them against Morse code. As I spoke, both men became visibly uncomfortable, not scared, concerned. The taller man never reopened his notebook. Eventually, the shorter man interrupted. "Did you successfully decode anything?" "No." That answer seemed to relax them. A little, not completely. The questioning continued. Had the pattern changed recently? Had I shared it with anyone? Had I recorded it? That last question seemed especially important. I admitted I had recordings. Again, the men exchanged looks. The shorter man asked if he could hear them. Against my better judgment, I agreed. I played several samples. Both men listened silently. Neither took notes. Neither reacted visibly. Yet something felt wrong. Halfway through one recording, I noticed the taller man staring toward the tower outside. Not listening, watching, like he expected something. The audio ended. The room remained silent. Then the shorter man asked, "Have you ever received a response?" "What do you mean?" Neither answered immediately. The shorter man simply shook his head. "Never mind." The interview ended shortly afterward. Both men stood. The shorter man thanked me for my cooperation. Then he said something strange. "If the pattern changes, please leave." "Leave where?" "The tower." That was all. No explanation, no clarification, just leave. I watched them walk back to the sedan, then drive away. The entire encounter lasted maybe 30 minutes. I didn't get names, didn't get credentials, nothing. That night I stayed anyway, mostly because I was irritated. The warning felt absurd. The knocking began around 10:50 p.m., same pattern, same rhythm, nothing different. Then shortly after midnight it changed. For the first time, instead of 3 knocks, there were 4. Pause. 4 more. Long pause. Then 4 again. I sat frozen inside the building, listening. The sequence repeated, over and over, different from before, deliberately different. I remembered the shorter man's warning. If the pattern changes, leave. For reasons I still can't explain, I packed my equipment immediately. No hesitation, no debate. I just left. Halfway down the access road, I glanced back through the trees. The tower stood silhouetted against the night sky, and for a moment I thought I saw 2 figures standing at its base, motionless, watching it. Not watching me, watching the tower. The next morning I returned. Everything appeared normal. No figures, no vehicles, nothing. The tower restoration continued for another 3 weeks. The knocking never happened again, not once. Before leaving the site permanently, I reviewed every recording I'd made. Most sounded exactly as I remembered, except one, the final recording. The one from the night after the 2 men visited. The night the pattern changed. The audio contained the knocks. 4, pause, 4, pause, 4. But underneath them, barely audible, there was another sound. A voice, not speaking clearly, just murmuring, as though someone stood very far away. I boosted the volume repeatedly, cleaned the audio, filtered the noise. Eventually I made out a few words, only a few, enough to understand them. The voice wasn't responding to the knocking, it was counting along with it. I first saw it around 2:15 in the morning on a stretch of highway, so empty it felt abandoned. I was driving home from a friend's house in western Kansas. My buddy Nate had recently bought a small place outside Garden City, and I'd stayed later than planned helping him install new kitchen cabinets. By the time I left, it was cold, windy, and completely dark. Not storming, just one of those nights where low clouds covered everything and reflected almost no light back down. The highway was empty. No cars ahead. No cars behind. Nothing. I'd driven that route dozens of times before. The nearest town was nearly 40 miles away. I remember because I'd just passed a mile marker when something caught my attention through the driver's side window. At first I thought it was a distant radio tower light. Then I realized it was moving. The light wasn't particularly bright. Maybe about as bright as a helicopter spotlight viewed from far away. White. Steady. No blinking, no flashing, just moving. I glanced over again. It appeared to be matching my speed. That got my attention. Not because it seemed impossible, because it seemed strange. The terrain out there is mostly flat farmland. If another vehicle was traveling on a parallel road, I probably would have seen headlights. There weren't any. The light remained off to my left, maybe half a mile away, maybe farther. Distance was difficult to judge. I watched it for several minutes. Sometimes it appeared slightly ahead of me, sometimes slightly behind, always moving, always keeping pace. Eventually I convinced myself it was probably an aircraft, maybe a helicopter, maybe something else. The problem was that I never heard anything. I rolled down the window. Cold air rushed inside. Nothing. No engine noise, no rotor noise, just wind. I drove another 10 miles. The lights stayed with me, not exactly beside me, just somewhere off to the left, always there. At one point I slowed down. The lights slowed too. I sped up. It seemed to speed up. Again, nothing dramatic, nothing impossible, just odd. I remember feeling increasingly uncomfortable, not frightened, just unsettled. The kind of feeling you get when something doesn't quite make sense, but you can't explain why. Then I noticed something else. The light wasn't bouncing. If it was a vehicle crossing rough terrain, it should have moved vertically. If it was an aircraft, I'd expect some change in position. Instead, it appeared remarkably steady, almost fixed, like it existed at a constant point relative to me. That thought bothered me more than anything else. Around 20 minutes later, I approached a long curve in the highway. The road bent right. The light should have shifted position. It didn't. For a few seconds, it remained exactly where it had been. Then it disappeared, not faded, not moved away. Gone. One moment there, next moment gone. I immediately checked my mirrors. Nothing. The sky looked empty. The fields looked empty. Everything looked normal. The rest of the drive passed without incident. By the time I reached home, I'd mostly convinced myself I was overthinking it. A few days later, I told Nate about it. Then my brother. Then one coworker. That was it. I didn't post anything online, didn't report it, didn't mention it publicly. Life continued. Weeks passed. Then small things started happening. The first thing was the phone calls. 3 separate times I answered my cell phone and heard silence. Not static, not background noise, just silence. Then the call disconnected. I assumed telemarketers, scammers, wrong numbers, nothing unusual. Then I started noticing a dark sedan. Not every day, just occasionally. Parked across from my apartment, parked outside the grocery store, parked near work, always black, always tinted windows, always gone before I could get a good look. Again, maybe coincidence. I never got a plate number, never saw the driver. Still, it stayed in the back of my mind. About a month after the highway incident, I stopped at a gas station while driving back from Wichita. It was late afternoon, cold, cloudy, the kind of gray winter day where everything looks washed out. The station sat beside a lonely stretch of road surrounded by fields. I filled my truck and went inside for coffee. There were only 2 other customers, both men, both dressed in dark suits. That immediately stood out. Nobody wore suits around there, certainly not at a rural gas station. I didn't think much about it until I stepped back outside. The 2 men were standing beside my truck, not touching it, just waiting. One was tall and thin. The other was shorter with dark hair neatly combed back. Both looked somewhere in their 40s. The shorter man smiled politely. "Excuse me." I stopped. The smile never changed. Then he asked a single question. "Did it stay beside you the whole time?" That was it. No introduction, no explanation, no context, just that question. Immediately I knew what he meant. Not because the question was specific, because there was nothing else it could have referred to. I stared at him. My mouth actually opened before I could think of a response. Finally, I managed. "What?" Neither man reacted. The shorter one repeated the question exactly, word for word. "Did it stay beside you the whole time?" I remember looking between them, trying to understand what was happening, trying to figure out whether somebody was playing a joke. Neither appeared amused. Neither appeared threatening, just patient, waiting. I answered honestly, "No." The shorter man nodded. The taller man glanced briefly at him. Something about that glance felt important, like they were silently confirming something. Then the shorter man said, "Thank you." And that was it. Both men turned and walked away. I stood there watching. My brain struggled to catch up. Wait, neither stopped. "Who are you?" No response. I followed them toward the parking lot. The men reached the far edge of the station, then continued walking. Not toward a vehicle, just walking. I expected them to enter a car. They didn't. Instead, they crossed the road and disappeared behind a row of storage units. I hurried after them. Maybe 20 seconds passed. When I reached the other side, nobody was there. No pedestrians, no vehicles, nothing. The road stretched empty in both directions. The storage units sat locked and silent. The men were simply gone. I searched for several minutes. Nothing. Eventually, I gave up. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the encounter. Not because it was dramatic, because it was so specific. Only 3 people knew about the light. None of them knew details. I hadn't described its position, hadn't mentioned it pacing the truck, hadn't discussed how long it stayed there. Certainly not publicly. Yet somehow these strangers knew exactly which question to ask. Over the following weeks, I became increasingly curious. I called Nate. He swore he'd never told anyone. Same with my brother, same with my coworker. Nobody seemed to know anything. Life gradually returned to normal, mostly. Then another strange detail surfaced. While cleaning out my truck one weekend, I found an old receipt from that gas station. I almost threw it away. Then I noticed something. The timestamp. According to the receipt, I'd purchased coffee at 4:12 p.m. The problem was, I distinctly remembered arriving shortly after 3. The drive should have taken less than an hour. Yet my phone history showed I left Wichita at 2:47. The numbers didn't add up. I spent nearly an hour trying to reconstruct the timeline. Nothing made sense. Somewhere along the route, there appeared to be nearly 40 minutes unaccounted for. Not enough to be alarming, not enough to prove anything, just enough to bother me. Months later, I drove that highway again. Same route, same direction, same time of night. Partly because I wanted to see whether anything happened. Partly because I wanted to convince myself it was all coincidence. The road remained empty. The fields remained empty. Nothing unusual appeared. Around the same mile marker where I'd first noticed the light, I pulled over. The wind blew steadily across the fields. Everything looked normal. I sat there for several minutes. Eventually, I started the truck and prepared to leave. Then I noticed something scratched into the dusty passenger side window. Not carved, just traced with a finger through the dust. 4 words. Small enough that I almost missed them. The writing looked old, like it had been there for weeks, possibly months. The words read, "It fell behind there." I stared at the message for a long time, then wiped it away with my sleeve and drove home. The compass started spinning around 11:20 in the morning. At first, I thought I'd broken it. I was a geology graduate student at the time, working on a summer field mapping project in a remote section of northeastern Nevada. My advisor, Dr. Elaine Mercer, had secured funding to study fault structures in a stretch of rugged hills about 40 miles from the nearest town. Most days were simple. Drive out before sunrise, collect measurements, mark locations, come back covered in dust. The area felt empty in a way that's hard to explain unless you've spent time out there. No houses, no power lines, no traffic, just endless hills, dry gullies, scattered juniper trees, and silence. The day it happened was unusually hot. Even by Nevada standards, the sky was perfectly clear, no clouds, no wind, nothing. I was alone that morning because my field partner, Kevin Soto, had stayed behind with a stomach bug. The nearest person was probably 20 miles away. Around 11, I reached a rocky ridge overlooking a shallow valley. Nothing seemed unusual. I was taking measurements with a Brunton compass when the needle suddenly jerked sideways. Not drifted, jerked. I frowned and checked it again. The needle spun twice, stopped, then slowly pointed southeast. That wasn't right. I moved a few feet away. Same thing. I checked for metal, no fences, no equipment. Nothing nearby that should have affected it. I pulled out a second compass from my pack. The second one behaved exactly the same. That's when I started paying attention. I took a GPS reading, recorded the coordinates, then walked farther along the ridge. About 50 yards away, the compasses returned to normal. I walked back. The needles immediately became erratic again. I spent nearly an hour testing it. The anomaly seemed confined to a roughly circular area, maybe 30 feet across. The ground itself looked completely normal. No exposed metal, no unusual rocks, nothing obvious. I documented everything. Photographs, measurements, GPS coordinates, notes. The more I tested, the stranger it became. The interference wasn't consistent. Sometimes the compass pointed north, sometimes east, sometimes it spun slowly in circles. Once it locked onto a direction that didn't change no matter how I turned the instrument. I eventually radioed Dr. Mercer. She sounded interested, mostly excited. Geologists encounter magnetic anomalies all the time. Usually there's a geological explanation. Buried mineral deposits, magnetite, old mining debris, something. She told me to gather as much data as possible, so I did. The strange part came later. Around noon, I noticed something I hadn't paid attention to before. The area was unusually quiet, not silent, just missing certain sounds. Normally you hear insects, birds, wind moving through brush, something. I suddenly realized I hadn't heard any of that for several minutes. The silence wasn't complete, but it felt oddly focused, as if everything nearby had moved somewhere else. I remember standing there and becoming aware of my own footsteps, my breathing, the sound of gravel shifting beneath my boots. Everything else seemed distant. Then I heard a metallic sound, very faint, almost like someone tapping a wrench against a pipe. Clink, 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 3 times. The sound seemed to come from somewhere below the ridge. I walked toward it. Nothing. No vehicle, no people, no equipment. The sound didn't repeat. Eventually, I returned to work. Around 1:30, I packed up and headed back to camp. The drive out took nearly 2 hours. When I arrived, Kevin was sitting outside our trailer drinking water. The first thing he said was, "You look like hell." Apparently, I looked exhausted. I blamed the heat. That evening, I showed Dr. Mercer my notes. She became increasingly interested as she reviewed them, especially the compass data. She planned to revisit the location herself later in the week. The next morning, everything changed. I woke up early and checked my equipment. The primary compass no longer worked. The needle barely moved. The backup compass behaved even worse. It pointed south regardless of orientation. We assumed they'd been damaged, maybe heat exposure, maybe manufacturing defects. Annoying, but not impossible. Then my GPS unit started malfunctioning. Coordinates drifted, saved waypoints disappeared, battery levels fluctuated wildly. By afternoon, the device became completely unusable. Dr. Mercer joked that I discovered the world's most inconvenient haunted hill. Nobody took it seriously, at least not yet. 2 days later, we returned to the site together. The anomaly was gone, completely. The compasses behaved normally, GPS readings behaved normally, everything behaved normally. We spent hours searching the area. Nothing, no unusual rock formations, no buried debris, no evidence anything had ever happened. Dr. Mercer seemed disappointed. I felt relieved. The whole thing had started bothering me more than I wanted to admit. Life returned to normal, or mostly normal. Then small things began happening. Nothing dramatic, just odd. One evening, I noticed a dark sedan parked outside the motel where several members of our research team stayed. The vehicle sat there for nearly an hour, engine running. Nobody got out. Eventually, it left. The following day, I saw what looked like the same car parked near campus. Maybe coincidence, maybe not. A few days later, I stopped by Dr. Mercer's office. She looked distracted, tired. I asked if everything was okay. She hesitated, then told me something strange. Earlier that morning, 2 men had come looking for her. Neither identified themselves clearly, neither provided business cards. They simply asked questions about our fieldwork, specifically my anomaly. I laughed because I assumed she was joking. She wasn't. According to her, the men were polite, professional, well-dressed. They asked whether the magnetic readings had remained consistent over time, whether multiple instruments confirmed them, whether similar measurements had been reported elsewhere. Then came the strange part. The moment she mentioned the equipment failures, both men lost interest. Immediately. Not gradually. Instantly. One of them interrupted her, asked whether the devices had malfunctioned shortly afterward. When she said yes, the conversation essentially ended. The men thanked her for her time and left. That was it. No follow-up, no requests for data, no demand for records, nothing. I asked who they claimed to represent. Dr. Mercer frowned. They never really said. That bothered me, mostly because she wasn't the sort of person who became rattled easily. For the next few weeks, I tried not to think about it. Classes resumed, research continued, life moved on. Then I started noticing something else. The coordinates from my original field notes no longer matched. At first, I assumed I'd copied them incorrectly. But multiple notebooks showed different versions, not dramatically different, just enough. A few digits changed, a few numbers shifted. The location seemed to move slightly every time I checked. I blamed exhaustion, stress, human error. Reasonable explanations existed. Then I found the photographs. The images themselves appeared normal. Rocks, brush, dry hills, nothing unusual. But one picture bothered me. The photo showed the center of the anomaly area. I distinctly remembered taking it around noon. The image metadata said 4:17 p.m., hours later. I checked other photographs. Several timestamps were wrong. Not impossible. Camera clocks drift. Batteries fail. Still, the discrepancies felt strange given everything else. One evening, nearly 2 months after the original incident, I stayed late in the geology department lab. Most students had already left. The building felt empty. Around 9 p.m., I stepped outside. That's when I noticed the sedan again. Black. Parked across the street, engine off, dark windows. I stood there watching it. After about 30 seconds, the headlights turned on. The vehicle pulled away. No sudden movements, no drama, just left. The next morning, I found an envelope in my campus mailbox. No return address, no stamp, nothing. Inside was a single sheet of paper, blank except for one sentence typed in the center. Did the sound occur before or after the compass movement? That was it. No signature, no explanation, no contact information. I showed it to Dr. Mercer. Her face immediately changed, not fear, recognition. She asked where I'd gotten it. I explained. Then she told me something she'd never mentioned before. During her conversation with the two men, they'd asked about sounds, not magnetic readings, not instruments, sounds, specifically whether anyone heard metallic noises. At the time, she hadn't thought it mattered. Now she seemed less certain. Neither of us knew what to do with that information. Eventually, we filed the paper away and moved on, at least outwardly. The following spring, I graduated. Life took me elsewhere. Different state, different job, different projects. Years passed. The incident faded into the background. Then one afternoon, while sorting old research materials, I found my original field notebook. Tucked between pages near the anomaly entry was something I didn't remember placing there. A folded piece of paper, old, yellowed. Inside was a single handwritten note, not my handwriting, not Dr. Mercer's, just one sentence. The ink had faded slightly. I stared at it for several minutes before realizing what bothered me. The note read, "Good." It didn't stay consistent. Exactly the phrase Dr. Mercer remembered using when she described the equipment failure to the two men. A phrase she'd never written down, and a phrase I'd never recorded anywhere. I saw something crash into the woods when I was 16. That's the part everyone focuses on. The truth is, that's the least strange thing that happened. The really strange part came 12 years later. Back when I was 16, I lived in a small town in northern Michigan. My parents owned a house near the edge of a large state forest. There were miles of trees behind our property and only a handful of houses scattered along the road. One October evening, I was walking our dog, Scout. It had rained earlier. The ground was wet. The sky was clear except for a few low clouds moving east. I remember looking up because I noticed an unusually bright light crossing the sky. At first, I thought it was an airplane. Then it suddenly changed direction. Not sharply, just enough to seem wrong. The light moved lower, became brighter, then disappeared behind the tree line. A few seconds later, there was a flash somewhere deep in the forest. Not an explosion, not a fireball, just a brief burst of white light. Then darkness, no sound, nothing. Scout immediately started pulling toward home. I followed, that was it. No investigation, no government agents, no mysterious aftermath. The next day, some friends and I searched the area. We found nothing. No burn marks, no wreckage, no broken trees, nothing. Eventually, I stopped thinking about it. Life moved on. I graduated, moved away, got married, got divorced, moved again. The sighting became one of those odd stories you tell occasionally when weird topics come up. Nothing more. 12 years later, I was living alone in a small house outside Eugene, Oregon. The house sat on a quiet road surrounded by evergreens. Not isolated exactly, but private. My nearest neighbor was several hundred feet away. I worked remotely doing bookkeeping for a construction company. Most days were quiet, routine, normal. Then small things started happening. At first, they seemed unrelated. A door I'd thought was locked would be unlocked. Not wide open, just unlocked. I'd assume I forgot. A kitchen cabinet would be slightly open. I'd close it, think nothing of it. One morning, I found a living room lamp turned on. I was certain I'd turned it off before bed. Again, easy enough to dismiss. People forget things, especially when living alone. Then I noticed something stranger. A framed photograph in my hallway had been moved. Not much, just slightly crooked. The thing that bothered me was that I rarely touched it. I straightened it, forgot about it. 2 days later, it was crooked again. Around that time, I began having the feeling that someone was watching the house. No evidence, no sightings, just a feeling, the kind that comes and goes. I hated that feeling because it sounds irrational. Maybe it was. Still, I started checking windows before bed, checking locks twice, looking outside more often. Nothing ever appeared unusual. Weeks passed, then came the photographs. I discovered them by accident. I was cleaning out a drawer in my home office when I found a manila envelope. I'd never seen it before. No address, no writing, nothing. Just an envelope. Inside were 6 photographs. Every single one showed part of my house, not the exterior, the interior. My kitchen, my living room, the hallway, the guest bedroom. At first I assumed someone was playing a prank. maybe old real estate photos. Then I looked closer. They weren't old. One photograph showed a coffee mug I'd purchased less than a month earlier. Another showed a stack of unopened mail sitting on my dining table. A third showed my dog sleeping on the couch. The photos had clearly been taken recently. Inside my house, I immediately called the police. They came out, looked around, found no signs of entry, no evidence, no fingerprints worth mentioning. Nothing. The officer suggested someone might have had access before I bought the property. That explanation made no sense. The photographs were recent. The dog hadn't even lived with me until 2 years after I moved in. For several days, I barely slept. Every creak in the house got my attention. Every noise outside made me check windows. Nothing happened. Then things became quiet again. Almost too quiet. 3 weeks later, around 10:30 on a rainy Thursday morning, someone knocked on the front door. I wasn't expecting anyone. When I opened it, 2 men stood on the porch. Dark suits, dark ties, polished shoes. Neither carried umbrellas despite the steady rain. Both appeared completely dry. One was tall and thin, the other shorter with neatly combed gray hair. The shorter man smiled politely. "Miss Corbett?" I nodded. His smile widened slightly. "We apologize for being behind schedule." That was the first thing he said. Not hello. Not an introduction. Not a reason for visiting. Just an apology. I remember immediately feeling confused. Behind schedule for what? Neither answered. Instead, the shorter man asked if they could come inside. Every instinct told me to say no. Instead, I hesitated. The men seemed oddly familiar. Not familiar in appearance, familiar in presence, like I'd met people exactly like them before. Calm, professional, emotionless beneath the surface. I eventually let them inside. The conversation began with questions about the sighting, the one from when I was 16. That immediately caught me off guard. I hadn't discussed it publicly in years. The shorter man asked me to describe what I saw. I did, the same story I'd always told. Light, trees, flash, nothing afterward. He listened carefully. The taller man took notes. Then came the strange questions. Not about the light, about timing. How long had I looked at it? How many seconds? Which direction had I been facing? What shoes was I wearing? Did I remember whether Scout barked before or after the flash? The details felt absurd, yet both men seemed genuinely interested. At one point, I finally asked who they were. The shorter man smiled. No answer, just another question. Then the conversation took a turn. The taller man reached into a leather folder, removed several photographs, placed them on my coffee table. My stomach dropped. They were the same photographs I'd found in the envelope, the exact same ones. Kitchen, hallway, living room, dog, everything. The shorter man looked almost embarrassed. Again, our apologies for the delay. I stared at him. What delay? No answer. Instead, he pointed to one photograph, the hallway image. Has anything changed here since this was taken? I felt genuinely frightened for the first time. Not because they threatened me, because they acted as though the photographs were completely normal. Routine, administrative, like paperwork. I asked where they got them. Neither answered. I asked who took them. Neither answered. The shorter man simply continued asking questions. Eventually, I interrupted. Did someone come into my house? Silence. Then, that isn't the concern. The way he said it made my skin crawl. Not threatening, not aggressive, just matter of fact, as if my question missed the point entirely. The conversation continued for nearly 40 minutes. Every question returned to the sighting. Not the photographs, not my house, the sighting. Toward the end, the taller man stopped taking notes and looked directly at me, for the first time. Up until then, he'd barely spoken. He asked, "Did you ever return to the location alone?" No. Never? Never. The 2 men exchanged a glance. Something seemed to relax between them. Then the shorter man stood. So it remained unresolved. I didn't know what that meant. Neither elaborated. The interview ended moments later. They thanked me for my time, walked to the front door, then left. I immediately followed. Not because I felt brave, because I wanted answers. The rain still fell steadily. The driveway sat empty. No vehicle, no sedan, no government SUV, nothing. The men were already walking down the road. I watched them disappear around a bend, nearly a quarter-mile away. That shouldn't have been possible. Only seconds had passed. Yet somehow they'd covered an impossible distance. I stood there in the rain trying to make sense of it. Then I noticed something. The muddy ground beside the porch held footprints. Lots of them. Mine. The mail carriers, delivery drivers, normal tracks, but there were no footprints belonging to the two men, not a single one. The mud where they'd stood remained perfectly undisturbed. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the photographs. The next morning, I pulled them out again. I examined every detail, every reflection, every shadow. That's when I noticed something I'd missed. In one of the living room photos, a figure stood outside the sliding glass door. Not inside, outside, partially obscured by reflections. A person. Watching the house, the figure appeared tall, wearing dark clothing, standing motionless near the tree line. I don't know how I missed it before. Maybe because it blended into the shadows. Maybe because I wasn't looking for it. I checked the remaining photographs. The same figure appeared in 3 others. Always distant, always outside, always watching. None of the images showed the face clearly, just the outline. I eventually checked the timestamps embedded in the digital scans. Every photograph had been taken during the previous week, the exact week before the men arrived. The final image showed my living room from an angle that shouldn't have been possible. The camera appeared positioned inside the room, near the hallway, facing toward the couch. I spent nearly an hour trying to determine where the photographer had been standing. Then I noticed something in the background. The hallway photograph hanging on the wall, the one that kept becoming crooked weeks earlier. In the image, it hung perfectly straight. But someone had written a small date on the bottom corner of the photograph frame, a date I had never seen before. A date that matched the day of the sighting back when I was 16. The same date I'd completely forgotten until I dug through old journals afterward. The photograph frame still hangs in that hallway. The writing isn't there. It never was. Only in the picture. I first noticed the house because somebody was finally living in it. That probably sounds strange, but the place had sat empty for years. I lived in a small neighborhood outside Olympia, Washington. Mostly older homes surrounded by tall evergreens. Quiet streets, not much traffic, the kind of place where everyone noticed when a new car appeared. The house directly across from mine had been vacant for as long as I could remember. Not abandoned, just empty. The lawn got mowed. The property taxes were apparently paid. Sometimes contractors showed up, but nobody ever lived there. Then one spring, a moving truck appeared. Within a week, a man had moved in. His name was Victor Hale. At least that's what he introduced himself as. He looked to be in his late 50s. Polite, quiet, lived alone. The first time we spoke was while I was checking my mailbox. He walked over and introduced himself. Nothing unusual, normal conversation. He said he'd recently relocated from Idaho, mentioned enjoying the quiet, asked where the nearest grocery store was. That was it. Over the next few months, we'd occasionally chat. Not friends exactly, just neighbors. Victor always seemed slightly distracted, not nervous, just preoccupied. Sometimes I'd wave and he'd respond several seconds later, like he'd been deep in thought. Still, nothing about him felt alarming. If anything, he seemed lonely. Summer passed, then autumn arrived. Around that time, I started noticing odd little things. Nothing dramatic, just details that didn't fit. Victor rarely had visitors. In fact, I never saw anyone enter the house. No family, no friends, nobody. Yet occasionally lights appeared in rooms that should have been empty. I'd notice movement behind curtains late at night, shadows crossing windows, the sort of thing you dismiss immediately. People move around their homes, nothing unusual. Except the shadows sometimes appeared in multiple rooms at once. Again, probably explainable. I never thought much about it. The first genuinely strange thing happened in November. A cold fog had rolled in that evening. Not heavy enough to block visibility completely. Just enough to soften everything. Streetlights looked blurry. Houses seemed farther away. Around midnight, I woke up thirsty. I went downstairs for water. While standing in the kitchen, I happened to glance outside. Victor was standing on his porch. He wasn't alone. 2 men stood facing him. At first, I assumed they were twins. Then I realized they weren't just similar. They appeared identical. Same height, same build, same haircut, same dark suits, same posture. Even from across the street, I could tell something felt wrong. The 3 men weren't moving, just standing there, talking quietly, or at least Victor was talking. The other 2 barely moved at all. I watched for maybe 30 seconds. Neither identical man changed position, neither gestured, neither shifted their weight. Victor seemed nervous. I remember noticing that immediately. His hands kept moving, his head kept turning. The other two remained completely still. The scene made me uncomfortable for reasons I couldn't explain. Eventually, I went upstairs. I considered continuing to watch. Instead, I went back to bed. The next morning, Victor's driveway was empty. No moving truck, no car, nothing. The curtains were open. The house appeared vacant. I assumed he'd gone somewhere. Then I noticed something odd. His mailbox stood open. Empty. Later that afternoon, I knocked on his door. No answer. The following day, a for sale sign appeared in the yard. That caught my attention. Victor had lived there less than a year. I called the realtor number listed on the sign, mostly out of curiosity. The woman who answered seemed confused. When I mentioned Victor's name, there was a long pause. Then she asked, "Who?" I repeated it. More silence. Finally, she told me no owner by that name was associated with the property. I explained that he'd been living there for months.